The sun climbed slowly into the sky, painting the quiet suburban streets with streaks of gold that shimmered across manicured lawns and rows of unassuming homes. Among them, a sturdy brick colonial stood apart not because of its size or elegance, but because of the remarkable woman who lived within its walls. Inside, Nicole Anderson knelt to tie her running shoes, her fingers moving with a calm, practiced grace. The early morning jog wasn't just exercise for her, it was a sacred ritual, a stolen hour of peace before the world's chaos came knocking. To anyone watching, she might have looked like any other woman juggling the demands of a busy life. Her dark hair, pulled into a neat ponytail, her athletic wear practical yet understated. But beneath that quiet exterior burned an extraordinary truth. Nicole was the director of the FBI, a title she wore with humility rather than pride, a testament to the strength she'd forged through decades of struggle. Her journey to this point had been a winding road, carved through the rocky terrain of a childhood in Birmingham, Alabama, where the echoes of the civil rights movement still lingered like a heavy fog. She could still picture her father, a school principal with a voice that commanded respect, standing tall against the tides of prejudice, and her mother, a nurse whose gentle hands mended more than just body as they stitched hope into a fractured community. Together, they'd planted in Nicole a fierce belief that justice and education were the twin pillars capable of toppling even the most entrenched systems of oppression. Yet, despite their guidance, Nicole had faced her own battlements of searing doubt and quiet rage as she navigated a world that often refused to make room for a black woman with ambitions as vast as hers. Each step she took in that park, each breath she drew, was a quiet rebellion against those who'd once tried to dim her light. The park itself was a haven of sorts, nestled beneath the sprawling branches of ancient oaks, their leaves rustling softly in the morning breeze. A winding path traced the edge of a glassy pond, where ducks glided lazily across the surface, oblivious to the human dramas unfolding nearby. It was a place where strangers brushed past one another, dog walkers, cyclists, joggers, each lost in their own worlds, rarely pausing to connect. The air carried a crisp chill that day, mingling with the distant hum of a city stirring awake. For Nicole, the rhythm of her footsteps against the pavement was more than physical, it was meditative, a space where she could untangle the knots of her day, strategize her next move, or simply let her mind drift. She adjusted her smartwatch, her gaze flicking briefly to the time, and set off, her pace steady, her breathing a metronome of control. Across town, Officer Matt Reynolds leaned against his patrol car, the chipped paint of its hood cool against his palm as he sipped lukewarm coffee from a styrofoam cup. Matt was a man caught in the tangle of his own contradictions, a veteran cop, with a chest full of commendations and a heart shadowed by something darker. To his colleagues, he was a figure of authority, his broad shoulders and clipped tone exuding a confidence that teetered on the edge of arrogance. Some admired him for it, others whispered behind his back, wondering if his bravado masked a deeper insecurity. Raised in the same city he now patrolled, Matt had grown up in a working-class pocket where survival often trumped morality. His father, a cop before him, had worn the badge as a shield of honor, a way to serve a community he loved. But for Matt, it was different. The badge wasn't a calling, it was a scepter, a means to wield control in a world that had once made him feel small. That morning, his mind churned with a restless frustration. The department had been under a microscope lately, every misstep dissected by the public and the press. Matt didn't see himself as the problem, and never had, but the scrutiny gnawed at him, a constant itch he couldn't scratch. As he scanned the park, his eyes landed on Nicole, her figure cutting through the morning light with a quiet assurance that grated against his mood. To him, she didn't belong yet in that pristine gear, not with that purposeful stride, not here. She was an outlier, a spark to the dry tinder of his discontent. He straightened, tossing the coffee cup into a nearby trash can with a flick of his wrist, and stepped forward, his boots crunching against the gravel path. The encounter began subtly, a ripple in the stillness of the park. Nicole's shoes slapped rhythmically against the ground, her thoughts drifting to a case she'd been reviewing late into the night. She barely noticed Matt until his voice sliced through the air, sharp and unyielding. "Hey, you can't run through here without authorization. The words hit her like a sudden gust, jarring her from her reverie. She slowed to a stop, her chest rising and falling as she turned to face him, confusion creasing her brow. Round her, other joggers moved on, their paces unbroken, their eyes averted. The park was alive with motion, yet Matt's attention zeroed in on her alone. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice cautious but steady, a thread of disbelief woven into it. She glanced around, taking in the scattering of people who seemed untouched by the officer's scrutiny. "Is there a problem? I was just jogging like everyone else." Matt's lips curled into a smirk, but there was no warmth in it, only a cold, dismissive edge that made her stomach tighten. "Don't get smart with me," he snapped, his hand drifting to his belt, fingers brushing the holster there as if it were an extension of his will. "ID. Now." Nicole's face remained a mask of composure, but inside, a storm was brewing, waves of incredulity crashing against the shores of her restraint. "ID for jogging?" she asked, her tone sharp enough to cut through the morning haze. Matt stepped closer, his shadow stretching across her like a dark omen, his finger jabbing toward the badge pinned to his chest. "That's right. Unless you want to make this harder on yourself." The park seemed to hold its breath, the rustling leaves and distant bird calls fading into a tense silence. Nicole's hand moved slowly to her pocket, reaching for her phone, her every gesture deliberate as if navigating a minefield. But to Matt, that careful motion was a challenge, a spark of defiance he couldn't tolerate. In an instant, his hand shot out, clamping around her arm with a force that sent a jolt of pain up her spine. The humiliation hit her like a tidal wave, hot and suffocating, mingling with a fury she fought to contain. Her phone slipped from her grasp, clattering against the pavement with a sound that echoed in her ears. Gasps rippled through the growing cluster of onlookers, dog walkers pausing mid-stride, a cyclist balancing on one pedal, their faces a mix of shock and unease. "You're really doing this," Nicole muttered, the words slipping out under her breath, soft but laced with a fire that could have scorched the earth. She tugged against his grip, a reflex born of instinct, but Matt responded with a shove, propelling her toward the patrol car. Her footing faltered, her palms slamming against the hood as she caught herself. "Resisting, huh?" he sneered, the venom in his voice dripping like acid. "Guess that adds another charge." Nicole's hands trembled not from fear, but from the molten rage pooling in her chest. "All I did was jog," she said, her voice quaking with the effort of holding herself together. "All I did was exist, and that's the problem, isn't it?" Matt's response was a scoff, a guttural sound of contempt as he pressed her harder against the car, his weight a physical manifestation of the power he craved. Nearby, a woman in the crowd, middle-aged, with a sensible bob and a dog leash looped around her wrist, fumbled for her phone, her fingers shaking as she began to record. Matt's head snapped toward her, his eyes narrowing to slits. "You want to spend the night in a cell too?" he barked, his tone a thunderclap that silenced the murmurs around them. The woman hesitated, her resolve wavering under the weight of his glare. But she didn't lower the phone, not yet. Nicole, pinned against the car, felt the eyes of the crowd boring into her, their whispers a dull roar in her ears. She could have fought back, could have unleashed the full force of her authority then and there. But she didn't. Instead, she let the moment unfold, let the indignity wash over her like a baptism in fire. Her silence wasn't surrender, it was a blade, honed in the furnace of her restraint, waiting for the right moment to strike. Matt, smug in his triumph, didn't see the storm brewing behind her steady gaze. He didn't know who she was, what she carried within her, or the reckoning she was already plotting. As he drove away, the patrol car's engine rumbling with a self-satisfied growl, Matt believed he'd won. He'd put her in her place, asserted his dominance, sent a message to anyone watching. But he was wrong, catastrophically so. In the quiet of her mind, Nicole's thoughts churned like a gathering tempest. The system he thought he ruled was her domain, a machine she'd mastered through years of grit and sacrifice. His world, the one where he wielded power like a blunt instrument, was teetering on the edge of collapse, and he didn't even know it. What happens when a man intoxicated by his own authority realizes he's crossed the wrong soul? What happens when justice arrives not as a whisper, but as a deafening roar that shakes the foundations of his existence? And what will he do when he learns that the woman he sought to break holds the keys to his undoing? The answers loomed on the horizon, vast and unyielding, promising a reckoning that would echo far beyond that sunlit park. In that moment, the lesson crystallized just for Nicole, but for anyone watching. Power abused is a fragile thing, a house of cards waiting to topple under the weight of its own hubris. Justice, when it comes, doesn't bend to the whims of those who wield it unjustly. It rises, relentless and resolute, to claim what's owed. And for Nicole, a woman forged in the crucible of adversity, that justice was hers to shape, a force as unstoppable as the dawn breaking over the world she'd sworn to protect. As Nicole stepped lightly along the winding path of the park, her instincts hummed with a quiet alarm, whispering that this moment was veering toward something far from ordinary. The air felt heavy, charged with an unspoken tension, and when her eyes locked with his, time seemed to pause. It wasn't a recognition born of familiarity, no warm memories or shared history flickered between them, but rather a primal understanding of two forces standing on opposite sides of an invisible divide, a clash neither could yet name. Matt's voice sliced through the stillness, sharp and commanding, carrying a weight that prickled the skin on Nicole's neck and set her nerves alight. What unfolded next was a confrontation that felt like a storm long brewing, inevitable yet dreamlike in its intensity. His questions came fast, relentless, each one dripping with preconceived notions about her identity, her purpose, her right to be there. Nicole answered with a calm resolve, her words steady as a metronome, though inside, a fire of indignation smoldered, growing hotter with every syllable he spat. The exchange sharpened when Matt demanded her identification, his tone heavy with an authority she'd heard too many times before a ritual of control. She knew all too well. Around them, the park's tranquility dissolved as heads turned, eyes widening with a mix of curiosity and unease. Nicole's senses sharpened. She caught the glint of sunlight on phone screens as they emerged from pockets, the soft clicks of cameras rolling. She didn't flinch, didn't falter, but Matt fed off the attention like a man basking in applause, mistaking witnesses for admirers. His confidence swelled, his movements grew bolder, until his hand shot out, seizing her arm with a force that jolted her. In an instant, he pressed her against the hood of his patrol car, the cold metal biting into her skin. For Nicole, the world slowed to a crawl. Humiliation surged through her, not just for herself, but for every soul who'd stood where she stood now, pinned by the weight of unchecked power. She felt their ghosts in the ache of her bones, their struggles echoing in the tightness of her chest hose who dared to demand dignity, only to be met with this. The crowd's murmurs rose, a restless hum of discomfort, but no one stepped forward. Her silence wasn't surrender, it was a coiled spring, a mind racing with possibilities, weighing the power she held and the moment to unleash it. Not yet, she told herself, not here. Matt, meanwhile, radiated a smug satisfaction as he guided her into the back of his patrol car, the creak of the door a triumphant note in his mind. To him, this was routine, a flex of muscle, a reminder of order, another notch in a belt heavy with such victories. He didn't see the spark he'd ignited, didn't sense the tide turning beneath his feet. Back at the precinct, he scribbled his report with the same mechanical detachment he brought to every arrest, his pen scratching across the page without a flicker of curiosity about the woman he'd detained. Her name, scrawled carelessly in the paperwork, meant nothing to him, just another faceless figure to subdue, another lesson in submission delivered. He couldn't fathom that this name, dismissed with a flick of his wrist, would soon rise like a storm to unravel the very ground he stood on. Two lives, carved from wildly different worlds, had collided in that park, their paths now knotted in a struggle neither fully grasped. The rustling trees, the glint of the patrol car's chrome, the shifting crowd, they were merely the prelude to a reckoning, a symphony of justice swelling toward its peak. As dusk painted the city in hues of amber and shadow, Nicole sat in her office, the day's indignity no longer a wound to nurse but a fire to stoke. Her fingers tapped rhythmically on the desk, her mind a whirl of plans and promises, not just for herself, but for every person who'd felt that same cold grip of power. Across town, Matt cruised through the night, the hum of his engine a lullaby to his ignorance, blissfully blind to the tempest gathering on the horizon. What happens when brute force meets unwavering will? When arrogance tangles with a purpose forged in steel, the answer loomed ahead, vast and inevitable, a story destined to echo long after the final note. Meanwhile, the atmosphere at FBI headquarters crackled with an electric unease, a tension that had little to do with the usual chaos of high-stakes cases. It stemmed instead from the figure cutting through the corridors, Director Maya Ellis. Her steps were a metronome of intent, each click of her sharp heels against the gleaming floors a testament to the authority. She wielded a presence that didn't shout but commanded all the same. At 42, Maya was a force of nature, the youngest director in the Bureau's storied history and the first black woman to claim the title. Her power wasn't a gift handed down, it was a fortress she'd built brick by brick. Raised on Chicago's South Side, she'd grown up watching her father toil as a firefighter, his body worn thin by endless shifts, while her mother scrubbed floors to stitch their lives together. Resilience was Maya's inheritance, intelligence her weapon. She'd devoured her parents' tales of struggle, absorbed the sting of the inequities choking her neighborhood, and vowed before her voice had even lost its childish lilt to carve a different path. Her journey to the top was a gauntlet of grit and brilliance. Law school at Howard, internships where her presence stood out like a lone star in a dim sky, fieldwork where every move was scrutinized, every triumph questioned. Doubts thrown her way only sharpened her edge. When she ascended to director, the resistance was palpable. Veiled barbs from polished suits, sneers from those who saw her as an interloper. But Maya was a chess master, not a brawler. She played the long game, her every step deliberate, her focus a blade honed to perfection. By the time she settled into her role, she'd turned skeptics into believers and doubters into shadows. Her quiet strength a force that inspired both awe and dread. That's why her presence in the park that morning had felt so jarring, so out of orbit. Maya didn't pause, not for rest, not for breath unless the world demanded it. But her chief of staff, a weary man with a knack for reading her limits, had all but shoved her out the door, insisting she take a few hours to unclench her fists. Reluctantly, she'd agreed, trading her tailored suits for black leggings and a gray hoodie. Her curls swept into a practical bun. The park was her sanctuary that day, its towering trees swaying in a gentle breeze, their leaves whispering secrets above the distant giggles of children on swings. Her sneakers thudded against the trail, a rare piece settling into her bones until Officer Brian Caldwell shattered it. Caldwell, 48 and hardened by 15 years on the force, carried himself with the swagger of a man who'd never tasted defeat. His badge wasn't a shield, but a sledgehammer, wielded with a pride that masked his biases as duty. He called himself no nonsense, others might call him a bully. Complaints trailed him like exhaust stops turned into showdowns. Black and brown faces bearing the brunt, but the system swaddled him in impunity. When he spotted Maya jogging alone, he didn't see a titan of justice in running gear. He saw a black woman, solitary, her casual clothes a flimsy excuse in his warped lens to mark her as out of place. His assumptions snapped into place like a loaded clip, his voice barking out to her, slicing through the morning's calm. She stopped, bewildered, as he closed the distance, his uniform pristine, as if starched for intimidation rather than service. His demands escalated, each word a jab, louder, angrier, dripping with disdain. Maya's voice stayed even, a lifeline of calm she tossed into the chaos. But Caldwell wouldn't grab it. His hand clamped onto her arm, fingers digging in, and the crowd that had gathered froze to blow of uncertainty, phones trembling in their hands. Maya didn't thrash, didn't scream. Her restraint was a marvel, a fortress of control holding firm as her dignity was peeled away. Even as he shoved her against his patrol car, the metal cold and unyielding, her eyes burned into his, unblinking, etching every detail into her memory. The humiliation stung, sharp and deep, but beneath it lay something fierce and unshakable resolve, a promise to turn this moment into a weapon. When Caldwell finally let her go, shoving her back onto the path with a sneer, the crowd's murmurs swelled, a tide of unease with no outlet. Maya straightened, her gaze lingering on him a heartbeat longer than necessary, then turned away. For him, it was a petty victory, another tale to chuckle over later. For her, it was the ember that would ignite a blaze. Justice wasn't just a word to Maya, it was a vow, forged in the crucible of her life, and now sharpened by this day. Caldwell's world, built on sand, was about to crumble, and Nicole's fight, already brewing, would find an ally in the storm to come. The lesson was clear: power abused breeds its own downfall, and those who wield it without care will face a reckoning as fierce as it is deserved. The air hung heavy with disapproval, a silent chorus of judgment that no one dared to voice aloud. Maya crouched low to retrieve her fallen phone, her hands steady as a surgeon's despite the tempest roaring within her chest. She rose without a sound, her steps deliberate as she turned her back on Officer Brian Caldwell, leaving him to revel in the hollow glow of his misguided victory. Inside, her heart thundered not with fear, but with a quiet, smoldering resolve. She didn't glance back, not even once, as she walked away from the park, her silhouette cutting through the late afternoon haze like a blade. Back at headquarters, the atmosphere shifted the moment she stepped through the doors. The usual hum of activity dulled into something more cautious, more watchful. Maya slipped into her office, her face a mask of inscrutable calm. Though her team couldn't miss the faint rigidity in her posture, the way she carried herself with an even straighter spine than usual. It was as if she'd armored herself against an unseen enemy. They exchanged fleeting glances, their curiosity tempered by respect. No one dared breach the wall of silence she'd built around herself. Maya wasn't the type to unburden her soul over coffee, or confide in anyone about the storm brewing inside her. She was a vault, every emotion locked away with precision, and this moment was no exception. But what her colleagues couldn't see, what no one could possibly guess, was the intricate plan already unfurling in her mind. Caldwell's actions hadn't just bruised her pride, he'd ignited a war. And Maya Ellis didn't lose wars. Over the next few days, she moved like a shadow, methodical and unseen. She sifted through records, piecing together the jagged edges of Caldwell's career, his name scrawled across complaints, his arrogance etched into every disciplinary note that had somehow been buried. Under layers of bureaucratic neglect, each document she uncovered fueled the fire in her gut. But she didn't rush. Patience, she knew, was a weapon sharper than any blade, and she wielded it with the finesse of a master strategist. She had no desire to confront him yet, no urge to let him see the storm gathering on the horizon. Let him strut and preen in his ignorance, she thought. Let him believe he'd won. The longer he wallowed in his delusion, the sweeter it would be when she pulled the rug out from under him. Meanwhile, Caldwell strutted through his days like a peacock, oblivious to the noose tightening around him. At the precinct, he leaned back in his chair, a chipped coffee mug in hand, regaling his colleagues with a warped version of the incident at Lakeview Park. His voice boomed with self-assured laughter as he painted himself as the gallant enforcer, the hero who'd put an entitled jogger in her place. She thought she could mouth off to me, he sneered, his disdain dripping like venom. Around him, the room split into camps, those who nodded along, feeding his ego with their silence, and those who averted their eyes, unwilling to tangle with the beast he'd become. He thrived on it, that unspoken fear, the way his presence seemed to bend the world to his will. His arrogance blinded him to the truth. The jogger he'd humiliated wasn't just anyone. She was Maya Ellis, a name he'd soon come to dread. As days stretched into weeks, a subtle tension coiled tighter at headquarters. Maya's team sensed the shift and heard a sharper edge to her voice during briefings. The way she lingered in her office long after the others had gone home. Papers piled up on her desk, illuminated by the soft glow of her lamp as she pored over files late into the night. Her colleagues couldn't name the change, but they felt it in their bones. Something big was brewing, something that would ripple far beyond the walls of their building. They didn't yet know it, but the reckoning she was orchestrating would rewrite everything. For Officer Brian Caldwell, the morning started like any other. He lounged at his desk in the precinct, his third cup of coffee sloshing in his hand as he recounted his latest triumph. To a captive audience, his laughter bounced off the drab gray walls, a grating sound laced with the kind of confidence that only years of unchecked power could breed. The officers around him reacted predictably. Some offered half-hearted chuckles. Others stared at their paperwork, unwilling to provoke the man who'd made a career out of intimidating anyone who crossed him. Brian relished it, the way his words seemed to command the room, the way no one dared call him out. Today felt like just another chapter in his reignuntil. His commanding officer, Lieutenant Hargrove, approached, his face a blank slate that gave nothing away. "Caldwell," Hargrove said, his voice clipped, "Director Ellis wants to see you. Now." Ryan's brow creased, a flicker of unease darting up his spine like an electric shock. Director Ellis. The name carried weight, a quiet authority that echoed through the ranks. But he'd never dealt with her directly, or so he believed. "What's this about?" he asked, forcing a casual tone, his lips curling into a smirk that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Don't know," Hargrove replied, his expression unchanging. "But I wouldn't keep her waiting. She's not the patient type." The walk to her office stretched longer than it should have, each step echoing in the tiled hallway like a drumbeat counting down to something inevitable. Ryan tried to shake the nagging sense that something was off, burying it beneath the swagger that had carried him this far. He was untouchable, he told himself. Whatever this was, he'd talk his way out of it. When he reached the door, the receptionist barely lifted her gaze, her hand flicking toward the office with a curt gesture. He pushed the heavy door open and stepped inside, the air thick with a presence he couldn't yet name. Maya Ellis sat behind her desk, her posture radiating command, her office a pristine fortress of order. The walls gleamed with polished wood, the shelves lined with books and awards that spoke of a career built on steel and determination. She didn't look up immediately, her pen scratching across a document with deliberate strokes. Ryan's bravado faltered for a heartbeat, but he squared his shoulders and strode forward, determined to hold his ground. He didn't recognize Hernet yet. "Officer Caldwell," she said at last, her voice slicing through the silence like a scalpel, steady yet edged with something dangerous. "Take a seat." He hesitated, his eyes darting over her face, searching for a clue. There was something familiar in the set of her jaw, the piercing intensity of her gaze, but he couldn't place it. He sank into the chair across from her, his fingers brushing the armrests as he tried to project confidence. "Director Ellis," he began, lacing his words with forced politeness. "To what do I owe the pleasure?" She didn't answer right away. Instead, she leaned back slightly, studying him as though he were a specimen under a microscope. The silence stretched, heavy and suffocating, until she finally spoke, her words slow and deliberate. "Do you recall an incident at Lakeview Park 2 weeks ago? A confrontation with a jogger?" Brian stiffened, his mind racing back to that day, the woman in running gear, the way he'd grabbed her arm, the crowd that had gathered as he barked orders. He shrugged, feigning indifference. "I've had a lot of interactions, ma'am. You'll have to be more specific." Maya's eyes narrowed, her gaze cutting through his flimsy pretense like a laser. She leaned forward, her hands resting lightly on the desk. "Let me jog your memory. A black woman jogging alone, stopped without cause, physically restrained, publicly humiliated, accused of resisting arrest. Does that ring any bells?" The room seemed to shrink around him, his throat tightened as the pieces clicked into place, a cold sweat prickling at the back of his neck. The jogger, it was her. His heart slammed against his ribs, but he fought to keep his face neutral. He started, but the words dissolved before they could form. "I see you remember now," Maya continued, her voice cool, but laced with a quiet fury that made his skin crawl. "What you did that day wasn't just an abuse of power. It was a violation not just of my rights, but of the very principles you swore to uphold when you put on that uniform." Ryan's hands gripped the chair, his palms slick against the leather. "You didn't realize. You didn't realize who I was," she cut in, her tone razor sharp. "And that's the problem. It shouldn't matter who I am. Your actions that day were unacceptable, period. You acted out of prejudice, not duty. You used your badge to demean and intimidate, and you thought there'd be no consequences." He opened his mouth to argue, but she silenced him with a raised hand, her authority absolute. "Save it. I've reviewed your record, Officer Caldwell's complaints, the disciplinary actions that were conveniently ignored, the systemic failures that let you operate unchecked. I've seen it all. And soon, so will the public." His blood turned to ice. "The public," he croaked, the word barely audible. Maya leaned back, her calm more terrifying than any outburst. "Yes, the public. As of tomorrow morning, an internal investigation into your conduct will launch. Every complaint against you will be reopened, and this time, there will be accountability." His mind spun, grasping for an escape. "Director Ellis, please, if this isn't necessary, It is necessary," she interrupted, her voice rising just enough to underscore her resolve. "People like you rely on the system to shield you from the consequences of your actions. But the system isn't yours to abuse. Not anymore." The weight of her words crashed over him, a tidal wave he couldn't outrun. He tried one last desperate plea. "I made a mistake, okay? I'm sorry. I'll do better." Her expression didn't waver, her eyes cold and unyielding. "Your apology means nothing to me. What matters is justice. You thought you could intimidate me into silence, but you've underestimated the wrong person." The silence that followed was a void, swallowing every shred of his bravado. Brian sat frozen, the reality of his unraveling life sinking into his bones. He'd spent years wielding his badge like a scepter, believing himself invincible. Now, he faced the bitter truth. Power misused had a price, and he was about to pay it in full. Maya rose from her chair, her movement fluid and final. "You're dismissed, Officer Caldwell. I suggest you prepare for what's coming." He stumbled to his feet, his legs trembling as he shuffled toward the door. Just before he crossed the threshold, her voice stopped him cold. "And Caldwell," she said, her tone a quiet promise, "this is only the beginning." The door clicked shut behind him, sealing his fate. Outside, the precinct buzzed on, oblivious to the storm that had just broken. But for Brian, the world had shifted irreversibly. Justice, he realized too late, wasn't just a word, it was a force, and it had found him at last. The door slammed shut behind Brian Caldwell with a resounding thud that lingered in the air, a sound so final it seemed to carve itself into his very bones. As he trudged back to the precinct, each step felt like wading through thick, unrelenting mud. The weight of what had just transpired bore down on him, a crushing pressure that squeezed his chest and made his breath shallow. His career's one he'd painstakingly constructed brick by brick. The power he'd brandished with reckless abandon, it was all slipping away, like sand spilling through his trembling fingers. For the first time in years, a cold, unfamiliar sensation crept into his gut. Fear. It wasn't just a fleeting shiver, it was a deep, gnawing dread that clawed at him, whispering that the empire he'd built on bravado and intimidation was about to collapse. Inside his car, Brian sat motionless, his hands locked around the steering wheel in a vice-like grip, his knuckles blanched white, the tension radiating up his arms as if he could hold his fracturing world together. By sheer force of will, Maya's words delivered with that icy, unrelenting edge echoed relentlessly in his mind. "You should know that I don't lose." The phrase looped over and over, a merciless drumbeat that drowned out everything else. He tried to steady his ragged breathing, sucking in air that felt thin and useless, as though the car itself had become a vacuum, suffocating him with his own failures. Brian had always thrived on control of every situation, bent to his will, every interaction dominated by his presence. But now, alone in the dim glow of the dashboard, his carefully curated invincibility unraveled. He was powerless, a man teetering on the precipice of ruin, and the realization chilled him to his core. Fumbling with shaking hands, he reached for his phone, scrolling through his contacts with a desperate intensity, as if salvation might be buried among the names. His thumb hovered over one in particular, hesitation warring with urgency, before he finally pressed the call button. When the voice on the other end answered, rough, familiar, and tinged with impatience, Cebrian didn't waste time. "We need to talk now," he barked, his words sharp and clipped, betraying the storm raging within him. By the time he pulled into the gravel lot of a dimly lit bar on the edge of town, the panic that had gripped him earlier had hardened into a steely resolve. Though it did little to mask the tremor in his hands, he spotted Rick, his longtime friend and fellow officer, slouched in a booth at the back, a half-empty beer cradled in his hand. Brian slid into the seat across from him, his face a taut mask of desperation barely held in check. Rick arched an eyebrow, leaning back with a casual air that clashed with the tension radiating from Brian. "You look like hell, man. What's got you spooked?" he drawled, his tone light but his eyes sharp, taking in every twitch of Brian's expression. Brian didn't bother with small talk. There was no room for it. "You remember that jogger in the park a couple weeks ago?" he asked, his voice low and urgent. Rick's brow furrowed, a flicker of confusion crossing his weathered face. "Yeah, the one you wouldn't shut up about." "What about her?" Brian leaned in closer, his breath catching as he dropped the bombshell. "She's not just some nobody. She's my Alice, director of the damn FBI." The air between them seemed to freeze. Rick's hand paused, the beer glass hovering halfway to his lips. Slowly, deliberately, he set it down, his eyes narrowing as the weight of Brian's words sank in. "You're kidding me," he said, his voice flat, though the disbelief was palpable. Brian shook his head, his jaw clenched so tightly it ached. "I wish I was. She hauled me into her office today, told me she's launching an investigation. She's digging up every damn thing I've ever done." Rick let out a low, slow whistle, leaning forward now, his casual demeanor replaced by a grim seriousness. "That's bad, Brian. Really bad." "How much does she know?" Brian didn't answer, his silence a cavernous void that spoke louder than words. Rick exhaled heavily, dragging a hand through his thinning hair. "All right, look, you've wormed your way out of tight spots before. Just keep your head down. Ride this out." "She's not like the others," Brian cut in, his voice a hiss of barely contained frustration. "She's not gonna let this slide. She's coming for me, Rick. Full force." Rick studied him for a long moment, his expression unreadable, a mix of pity and exasperation flickering in his eyes. "What do you want me to do? Cover for you? Make it disappear?" Brian hesitated, his bravado faltering. Deep down, he knew the truth. This wasn't something Rick or anyone could sweep under the rug. He'd crossed a line, provoked a force far greater than himself, and now the consequences were barreling toward him like a freight train. "I don't know," he muttered at last, his voice hollow, stripped of its usual swagger. I can't let this destroy me." Rick leaned back, shaking his head as he drained the last of his beer. "You should have thought about that before you put your hands on her. She's got every reason to bury you, and she's got the power to do it." Brian's eyes flared with a mix of anger and desperation. "You think I don't know that? I don't need a damn lecture, I need a way out," Rick sighed, the sound heavy with resignation. "There might not be one, man. Not this time." Those words landed like a sledgehammer, cracking the last vestiges of Brian's confidence. He left the bar without another word, the night closing in around him, thick and oppressive, like a noose tightening with every step. His mind churned with dark possibilities, one bleaker than the last, this breath's coming harder, his legs heavier, as if the earth itself were pulling him down. The next morning, Brian sat at his desk in the precinct, the air thick with a tension so palpable it seemed to hum. Whispers trailed him like shadows, soft and insidious, as colleagues darted furtive glances his way when they thought he wasn't looking. The internal investigation had been officially announced, and his name was at its molten center. He tried to maintain his usual air of authority, squared shoulders. The hard-set jaw, but the strain was etched into every line of his face. Even the rookies, who once regarded him with a wary blend of admiration and fear, now averted their eyes, their footsteps quickening as they passed. The isolation was a living thing, wrapping around him, squeezing tighter with every avoided gaze. A sharp, deliberate knock shattered the silence. Brian's head snapped up, and there she was, Maya Ellis, standing in his office doorway, flanked by two agents whose stern faces mirrored her own unyielding resolve. Her presence was a storm rolling in, dark and heavy, filling the room with an authority that needed no words to assert itself. "Officer Caldwell," she said, her voice crisp and cutting, as pristine as the tailored suit she wore, "we need to have a conversation." He rose to his feet, his jaw tightening, a flicker of defiance sparking in his chest. "I thought we already did." He shot back, though his voice wavered ever so slightly. Her smile was a cold, precise, and utterly devoid of warmth. "This one will be a bit more formal. You'll want to follow us." The walk to the interrogation room was a slow, tortuous procession, a death march through the precinct's familiar halls. His colleagues watched in silence, their eyes a gallery of curiosity, unease, and something darker, judgment, perhaps. Inside the stark, fluorescent-lit room, Maya took her seat across from him, the two agents standing like sentinels by the door. She began without preamble. her voice steady and unrelenting. "I've reviewed the complaints against you. Excessive force, racial profiling, misconduct. It's a pattern, Officer Caldwell, a clear, ugly picture of who you are and how you've chosen to wield your authority." Ryan's hands curled into fists beneath the table, his nails digging into his palms. "I've done my job," he said, his tone defiant but brittle. "Nothing more, nothing less. Your job." Maya's voice sharpened, her gaze slicing through him like a scalpel. "Your job is to serve and protect, not to harass and humiliate, not to turn your badge into a bludgeon against the very people you're sworn to safeguard." He opened his mouth to argue, but she silenced him with a raised hand, her authority absolute. "You think this is just about me. It's not. For years, you've operated unchecked, shielded by a system that let you run roughshod over anyone in your path. That ends now." The silence that followed was suffocating, her words a tangible force pressing down on him, stripping away the armor he'd worn for so long. He could feel the walls closing in, the inevitability of his reckoning looming like a shadow he couldn't outrun. Maya leaned forward, her eyes locking onto his with an intensity that made his stomach twist. "You wanted to remind me of my place that day in the park. Well, let me remind you of yours. You're not above the law, Caldwell. You're not untouchable." He stared at her, his mind a chaotic whirl of denial and dread. For years, he'd believed himself invincible, a man who could twist the rules to his liking without ever facing the piper. But now, confronted by Maya's unwavering resolve, that illusion shattered. She wasn't just the woman he'd wronged in a fleeting moment of arrogance. Was a tempest, a harbinger of justice, and she wouldn't rest until the scales were balanced. The interrogation ended, but the consequences were only beginning to unfurl. As he left the room, the stares of his colleagues seared into him, each one a branding iron marking his fall from grace. The walls he'd built off arrogance, privilege, and unchecked power were crumbling, and there was nowhere left to hide. Later, in the dim corner of the precinct locker room, Brian sat alone, his head cradled in his hands. Maya's words from the interrogation echoed relentlessly, cutting through the tattered remains of his confidence like a blade through silk. The usual bustle of the locker room, laughter, the banter, the camaraderie was gone, replaced by a silence so loud it roared in his ears. Colleagues who once filled the space with noise now steered clear, their absence a condemnation more damning than any spoken accusation. The isolation wrapped around him like a shroud, its weight a constant reminder of how swiftly his world had unraveled. He barely registered Rick's approach, the soft scuff of boots on tile breaking the stillness. Rick lingered a moment, his broad frame casting a shadow over Brian, before speaking, his voice low and laced with unease. "Caldwell, they're not letting this go. You know that, right?" Brian looked up, his face pale and haggard, the lines around his eyes deeper than ever. "You think I don't know?" he rasped, his voice raw with exhaustion and bitterness. "Every step I take, every damn glance in my direction, it's like they're all just waiting for the axe to fall. And it's coming, Rick. I can feel it." Rick sighed, leaning against the lockers with a weariness that matched Brian's own. "You screwed up big time." But this he trailed off, shaking his head, the unspoken words hanging heavy between them. The lesson was clear, though neither voiced it aloud. Justice, when provoked, is a relentless force, and the abuse of power carries a price that no amount of bravado can evade. Brian had spent years wielding his authority like a club, blind to the consequences, convinced the system would always shield him. But Maya Elisharp, unyielding, and fueled by a righteousness he'd underestimated, had torn that shield away. She was the embodiment of retribution, a mirror reflecting the cost of his hubris. And as Rick stood there, a reluctant witness to his friend's downfall, the depth of Brian's isolation grew starker. Even the minor players, rookies who once idolized him, the colleagues who'd turned a blind eye, had become silent judges in a courtroom of his own making. The small events, the whispers, the avoided glances, the knock on his door had snowballed into an avalanche, burying the man he'd been. There was no outrunning this, no bargaining with the truth. Justice had found him, and its consequences would echo far beyond the walls of the precinct. The air in the locker room hung heavy, thick with the unspoken weight of everything that had spiraled beyond Brian's control. His hands, rough and callous from years on the force, curled into tight fists, the knuckles whitening as frustration surged through him like a wildfire. "Do you think I don't regret it?" he snapped, his voice climbing, raw and jagged with emotion. "I wasn't thinking straight, all right." I had no idea who she was. If I'd known, his words stumbled over each other, desperate and clumsy. But before he could finish, Rick's sharp tones sliced through the chaos like a knife. "If you'd known who she was, you'd have treated her differently. Is that what you're saying? Listen to yourself, Brian." The accusation landed hard, a stinging slap across Brian's conscience. For a fleeting moment, he froze, his breath catching as a storm of regret and defiance churned inside him. His mind raced images of that day in the park flashing like jagged shards of glass, cutting deeper with every recollection. Finally, his voice dropped to a low, bitter mutter. "I didn't mean for it to blow up like this. I didn't think it was a big deal." Rick shook his head slowly, the disappointment etched into every line of his weathered face. "And that's exactly the problem, Brian. It didn't matter to you not one damn bit. Not until the spotlight turned on you. And now you're scrambling to patch up a mess you never should have made." His words were heavy, deliberate, each one sinking into Brian like a stone dropped into dark water. Leaning back against the cold, chipped wall of the locker room, Brian felt the weight of it all pressing down on him, relentless and suffocating. For years, he'd moved through life with a kind of reckless confidence, his badge a shield that deflected scrutiny, his actions cushioned by a system that turned a blind eye to men like him. But that shield had crumbled now, stripped away by the rising tide of consequences he could no longer outrun. The door creaked open with a sudden jolt, and a young officer stepped inside, his face taut with urgency. "Caldwell, they need you in the conference room. Right now." The words hit Brian like ice water, sending a shiver of dread rippling through his core. His stomach twisted into knots, a sickening lurch that made his legs feel unsteady as he pushed himself upright. Every movement was sluggish, as if he were wading through thick, unforgiving mud. He didn't need to ask who they were at Bureau, the media, Maya Ellis. They'd all closed in, their presence looming like storm clouds on the horizon. Rick watched him go, his expression a mask of conflicted emotion, pity, frustration, maybe even a flicker of hope, but he said nothing, letting the silence speak for itself. The conference room was a stark contrast to the dim chaos of the locker room. It buzzed with an oppressive formality, the air thick with tension that seemed to cling to every surface. At the head of the long, polished table sat Maya Ellis, her posture unyielding, flanked by a row of stern-faced officials and legal advisors in crisp suits. Their eyes tracked Brian as he entered, each gaze a silent judgment that made his skin prickle. He felt exposed, vulnerable, like a man stepping onto a gallows with the noose already swaying above him. Every step toward the empty chair echoed in his ears, a hollow reminder of how far he'd fallen from the untouchable figure he'd once been. Maya didn't speak at first, letting the silence stretch out, heavy and deliberate, until it filled the room like a living thing. When she finally broke it, her voice was steady, measured, but carried the unshakable authority of someone who'd spent decades clawing her way toward justice. "Officer Caldwell, we've concluded our review of the complaints against you. The evidence is overwhelming. What happened in the park wasn't a one-off mistake. It's part of a long, ugly pattern of behavior that's been ignored for far too long." Brian's mouth opened, a weak protest forming on his lips, but Maya raised a hand, silencing him before he could even begin. "This isn't the time for excuses. This is about accountability. You took an oath to protect and serve, and you've broken that promise repeatedly." Her words cut through him, sharp and unrelenting, stripping away every flimsy defense he'd built in his mind. He sat there, hands clenched so tightly in his lap that his nails dug into his palms. As she continued, "Effective immediately, you're suspended without pay. Pending a full investigation, the Bureau will work with external agencies to ensure justice is served. No shortcuts, no favors." The finality of her statement slammed into him, a brutal punch that left him reeling. He'd braced himself for consequences, but hearing them laid out so plainly, with such cold precision, was something else entirely. The room seemed to shrink around him, the walls pressing in as the reality of his actions crashed down with a force he couldn't bear. When the meeting ended, the others filed out, their footsteps a distant echo in Brian's ears. He stayed rooted to his chair, his mind a chaotic whirl of anger, regret, and creeping fear. Maya approached him, her calm demeanor unshaken, though her eyes held a quiet intensity. "This didn't have to happen, Caldwell. You had choice better once and you didn't take them. Now you're left with the fallout." Her voice was a mirror, reflecting back the decisions he'd made, the arrogance he'd worn like armor, the lives he'd brushed aside without a second thought. He wanted to argue, to throw back some justification that would ease the sting, but the truth stared him down, unblinking and undeniable. As she turned to leave, he called after her, his voice cracking under the strain. "Is this about revenge? Is that what's driving you?" She paused, turning to meet his gaze with a steadiness that made him feel small. "No, this isn't revenge. This is justice. And justice doesn't bend for your excuses or your regrets, it demands what's right." With that, she walked away, her heels clicking against the floor, leaving Brian alone in the suffocating silence. He sat there for what felt like an eternity, her words a relentless pressure against his chest. For the first time, he couldn't dodge the reality of what he'd done, a trust he'd shattered, the people he'd hurt, the oath he'd treated like an afterthought. The lesson was brutal, a reckoning that stripped away the illusion of power he'd clung to for so long. Justice wasn't a game to be manipulated, it was a force that demanded accountability, and he'd abused his authority until it turned on him with unforgiving precision. Days later, Brian sat on the edge of his sagging mattress, staring at the peeling wallpaper of his cramped apartment. The room was eerily still, save for the faint hum of traffic filtering through the cracked window. His uniform hung in the closet, gathering dust, a relic of a life that felt distant now. He hadn't touched it since the suspension, and a quiet part of him wondered if he ever would again. The silence was oppressive, amplifying the thoughts that gnawed at him, relentless memories of the park, of Maya's piercing voice, of the choices that had led him here. Each one replayed in vivid detail, sharper and more punishing with every loop. A sharp knock shattered the quiet, jolting him upright, his body tensed, reluctant. But he dragged himself to the door. Rick stood there, his broad frame filling the threshold, his face a mix of worry and exasperation. Without waiting for an invite, he stepped inside, shutting the door with a firm thud. His eyes swept over the mustardy dishes stacked in the sink, papers scattered across the table like fallen leaves, and Brian caught the flicker of judgment in his friend's gaze, a spark of shame igniting in his chest. Rick didn't mince words. "You look like hell, man." Brian shrugged, his voice flat and lifeless. "What do you want, Rick?" Crossing his arms, Rick leaned against the wall, his stance casual but his tone edged with purpose. "I want to know what you're going to do. You've been holed up here, wallowing in self-pity, but that's not going to fix a damn thing." Brian's jaw tightened, a flare of defensiveness rising in his throat. "What am I supposed to do? They've already decided I'm done." Maya Ellis made sure of that. Rick let out a sharp, frustrated sigh, his patience wearing thin. "This isn't just about her, Brian. It's about you. You're the one who dug this hole. You made the calls that landed you here." Brian's eyes flashed with anger as he shot back. "You think I don't know that? You think I don't sit here every damn day replaying it, hating myself for it? I screwed up. Ricky, get it, but it's too late now. They're going to bury me." Rick's voice softened, though the steel remained. "Maybe you've got it coming. Maybe this is what it takes for you to finally see the wreckage you've left behind. But that doesn't mean you can just give up." The fight drained out of Brian, his shoulders slumping as he sank onto the worn couch, burying his face in his hands. "I don't even know where to start," he muttered, the words muffled against his palms. Rick sat across from him, his tone leveling out, more measured now. "Start by owning it. Stop pointing fingers and face what you've done. You've got a shot to make this right, or at least trim it, not if you keep sitting here, waiting for someone else to clean up your mess." Brian didn't respond, his mind churning with the weight of Rick's words. He knew his friend was right, but the thought of confronting his failures head-on felt like staring into an abyss, terrifying and insurmountable. For years, he'd convinced himself he was above the rules, that his badge gave him license to act without consequence. Now that illusion lay in ruins, and he was left grappling with the pieces of a life he barely recognized. The next week, Brian was called back to the precinct. The meeting room was smaller this time, more intimate, with only a handful of people present. Maya Ellis sat at the head of the table, her expression as unreadable as ever, her presence commanding despite the simplicity of her dark blazer. Across from her was a woman Brian didn't know, her sharp features framed by a cascade of dark hair, her eyes burning with an intensity that made him uneasy. She introduced herself as Elena Torres, a civilian advocate who'd been tracking cases like his for years. Her voice steady but laced with a quiet fury. "I'm here to make sure the people you've hurt get heard," she said, her gaze locking onto his. "This isn't just about you anymore, it's about them, and the system that let you slide for so long." The room felt smaller with every word, the air thick with the gravity of what was unfolding. Brian's hands rested on the table, trembling slightly as he listened to Elena recount the stories people he'd dismissed, lives he'd disrupted, all piling up like evidence he couldn't deny. Maya watched him closely, her silence more piercing than any accusation. When she finally spoke, her voice was calm but resolute. "You thought your power gave you freedom, Caldwell. But power like that comes with a price, and you've been dodging the bill for too long. Justice isn't a suggestion, it's a demand, and it's here now, whether you're ready or not." As the meeting stretched on, Brian felt the lesson sink deeper. A bitter truth he couldn't escape. Abusing authority didn't just bend the rules, it broke trust, shattered lives, and left a debt that eventually came due. For the first time, he saw the faces behind his actions not as faceless complaints, but as people, each one a thread in the unraveling tapestry of his career. And as Elena's voice carried on, detailing the human cost of his choices, he realized that justice wasn't just punishment, it was a mirror, forcing him to confront the man he'd become. The room buzzed with a heavy, electric tension, the kind that pressed against your chest and made every breath feel deliberate. Rachel Morgan stood at the front, her posture unwavering, her dark suit sharp against the muted gray walls of the meeting space. She was an attorney who carried the weight of years of grievances on her shoulders, representing a chorus of voices that had long been silenced. Her clients, ordinary people with extraordinary courage, had entrusted her with their stories of pain. And today, she was their shield, their sword, their unwavering advocate. When she spoke, her voice cut through the thick air like a blade, steady yet laced with a quiet fury that demanded attention. "Officer Caldwell," she began, her eyes locking onto the man seated across from her. "The individuals I stand for have been waiting for this day not just for weeks or months, but for years. They've waited for someone to finally hold you accountable, to look you in the eye and acknowledge the wreckage you've left behind. This isn't about a single moment in a park under the midday sun. This is about a chain of choices, a pattern of behavior that has rippled out and shattered countless lives." Brian Caldwell sat there, his uniform replaced by a plain sweater that clung to his slumped shoulders, his badge nowhere in sight. His throat felt like sandpaper, each swallow a struggle as Rachel's words landed like stones. He opened his mouth, the sound barely escaping a faint, raspy croak. I know I've messed up," he managed, his voice trembling with the weight of admission. "I can't go back and erase what I've done, but I need to make it right." His hands fidgeted in his lap, fingers twisting together as if trying to hold onto something slipping away. He felt exposed, raw, like a man standing in the rain with no shelter, every eye in the room peeling back the armor he'd worn for years. Rachel didn't flinch, her gaze held steady, piercing through his faltering defenses. "Words are cheap, Officer Caldwell," she said, her tone cool but unrelenting. "Anyone can string together a pretty apology when the walls start closing in. What matters is what you do, whether you're willing to back up that shaky promise with something real." Her words weren't just a challenge, they were a gauntlet thrown at his feet, daring him to pick it up. Beside her, Maya Ellis leaned forward slightly, her presence quieter, but no less commanding. She was a woman of few words, but when she spoke, the room seemed to hold its breath. Her voice was calm, measured, yet carried an undercurrent of steel. "This isn't about dragging you through the mud for the sake of punishment, Caldwell," she said, her dark eyes studying him with an intensity that made him squirm. "It's about transformation. You've got a chance, hurry, a slim, fragile chance to turn this around. But it's not going to be a walk in the park, It's going to demand everything you've got. So tell me, are you ready to dig in and do the hard work? Or are you just hoping we'll let you off the hook with a few tears? Brian's chest tightened, his heart thudding against his ribs like a trapped bird. He could feel their stares, Rakel's fierce determination, Maya's quiet scrutiny boring into him, stripping away the bravado he'd once worn like a second skin. For years, he'd been the one in control, the one with the gun and the authority, the one who never had to answer for the fear in people's eyes. Now, he was just Brian, a man laid bare, forced to face the mirror of his own making. The silence stretched, heavy and suffocating, until finally he dipped his head, his voice a hoarse whisper. "Yes," he said, the word barely audible but carrying the weight of a vow. "I'm willing." The weeks that followed were a crucible, a relentless forging of a man who'd once thought himself unbreakable. Brian found himself in a cramped community center room, the fluorescent lights flickering overhead, surrounded by folding chairs and faces that didn't bother hiding their disdain. Mandatory sensitivity training wasn't a suggestion, it was a requirement. And the community leaders who ran it wielded their authority with unflinching honesty. They were men and women who'd seen too much, who'd lived through the consequences of officers like him, and they didn't soften their words. Hour after hour, Brian sat there, his notepad untouched, as people took the microphone and poured out their stories. A mother spoke of her son, humiliated in front of his friends for no reason but a power trip. A shopkeeper recounted years of harassment masked as routine checks. Each testimony was a jagged shard slicing into Brian's gut, forcing him to feel the pain he'd once dismissed as collateral damage. Maya was there too, often lingering near the back, her arms crossed, her expression a mask of quiet observation. She didn't need to say much, her presence alone was a reminder of what was at stake. But when she did speak, her words lingered like smoke after a fire. "You don't get to look away from this," she told him once, her voice low and deliberate. "This is the reality you helped build. Own it." Brian found himself glancing at her during those long sessions, searching her face for some sign of approval, some hint that he wasn't drowning in his own failures. She offered no easy comfort, but there was something in her steady gaze that pushed him forward, a silent challenge to keep going. One evening, after a session that left the room thick with emotion, a young man had broken down, recounting a night of terror at Brian's handshare outside felt crisp and cleansing. The parking lot stretched out under a sky bruised with twilight, the streetlights flickering to life, casting long, wavering shadows across the cracked pavement. Brian lingered near his car, his breath visible in the cool air, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. Maya was walking toward her own vehicle when he called out, his voice tentative, almost lost in the hum of distant traffic. "Director Ellis, can I ask you something?" She paused, turning to face him, her coat rustling softly in the breeze. Her expression was guarded, her eyes narrowing slightly as if weighing whether he was worth the time. "What is it, Caldwell?" she asked, her tone even but tinged with caution. He took a step closer, his boots scuffing against the asphalt, and drew a shaky breath. "Why are you giving me this shot?" he asked, his words spilling out in a rush. "After everything I've done, all the people I've hurt, you could have just let me crash and burn. Why didn't you?" Maya's gaze softened, but only just, a flicker of something human breaking through her stoic exterior. She stepped closer, her shadow stretching toward him under the amber glow of the lights. "This isn't about you, Caldwell," she said, her voice firm but not unkind. "It's about the people you've wounded, the trust you've torn apart. Giving you a chance to change doesn't wipe the slate clean, it doesn't undo the nights they spent afraid or the days they spent picking up the pieces. But if there's even a sliver of hope that you can learn from this, that you can stop being a wrecking ball and start being something better, then it's worth it. Not for you, for them." Her words landed like a punch, sharp and unyielding, and Brian felt his throat tighten, his eyes stinging with something he hadn't let himself feel in years. "Thank you," he said, his voice thick, cracking under the weight of gratitude and shame. "I don't deserve it, but thank you." Maya's lips pressed into a thin line, a hint of warmth flickering in her tone. "Don't thank me yet," she said, turning to walk away. "The real work's just getting started." Her footsteps echoed faintly as she disappeared into the dusk, leaving Brian standing there, the cool air biting at his skin, her words settling over him like a mantle he couldn't shake. For the first time in longer than he could remember, a fragile spark of hope flickered in his chest, a tiny, trembling light in the vast darkness he'd built around himself. Months later, Brian stood at a podium in the community center, the bright lights overhead bathing him in a harsh, unforgiving glow. The room was packed with residents with crossed arms, activists with notebooks, local leaders with weary eyes, all gathered to hear the man who'd once been a symbol of everything they loathed about the system. His hands gripped the podium's edges, his palms slick with sweat, his heart hammering so loud he was sure they could hear it. This wasn't a precinct briefing or a courtroom defense. This was judgment in its rawest form, unfiltered by legalese or protocol. He cleared his throat, the sound bouncing off the walls, and began, his voice low but steady. "I'm not here to beg for your forgiveness," he said, his eyes sweeping the crowd. "I haven't earned it, and I know that. What I did was wrong, not just that day in the park, but every time I chose power over people. Every time I leaned on my badge to intimidate instead of uplift. For years, I told myself it was just the job, that I was doing what had to be done. But that was a lie I fed myself and one I forced on all of you." The room was still, the silence heavy with a mix of skepticism, anger, and cautious curiosity. Brian could feel their stares, some burning with resentment, others searching for sincerity, and he didn't shy away. The past few months had been a reckoning, a slow unraveling of the man he'd been. He'd sat through those brutal training sessions, listened to the voices he'd once ignored, and peeled back the layers of arrogance that had kept him blind. Now, standing here, he felt naked but resolute. "I've heard your stories," he continued, his voice gaining strength. "I've felt the pain I caused, seen the trust I shattered, not just in single lives, but in whole neighborhoods. I can't unmake the past, but I can tell you this: I'm going to spend every day I've got left trying to set things right." In the front row, Maya watched him, her face a blank slate, though her eyes followed his every move. She'd been doubtful when he'd first asked to address the community, unsure if his words would ring hollow. But she'd given him the platform not because he deserved it, but because moments like this could ripple outward, touching lives he'd once broken. After he finished, people approached him, some with cautious thanks, others with sharp-edged distrust. Brian took it all in stride, his head bowed slightly, knowing trust was a mountain he'd have to climb one step at a time. As the crowd thinned, Maya stepped up to him, her arms still crossed, her posture relaxed but firm. "You held your own up there," she said, her voice neutral but carrying a faint undertone of respect. Brian nodded, rubbing the back of his neck. "It's the least I can do," he replied quietly. "It doesn't fix anything, but I'm trying." She studied him for a long moment, then said, "Actions outweigh words, Caldwell. Keep pushing forward, and maybe one day they'll see you're not the same man. But it's a long haul, and think it'll be smooth sailing." "I don't," he said, meeting her gaze with a determination he hadn't known he possessed. "But I'm not backing down." A ghost of a smile flickered across Maya's face, a rare crack in her armor. "Good," she said, "because the second you quit, all this turns to dust." She turned and walked away, leaving him to carry the weight of her words and the faint promise they held. In the months that followed, Brian threw himself into the work. He volunteered at youth centers, his once stiff demeanor softening as he listened to kids who reminded him of the lives he'd disrupted. He spoke at forums on police reform, his voice steady as he called for accountability, even when old colleagues glared from the back. For him, it wasn't about washing away his sins, it was about owning them, using them to build something better. Maya, meanwhile, saw her career shift. The investigation into Brian had sparked changes in the precinct, new rules, new oversights, cementing her as a force who didn't just uphold justice, but reshaped it. Rick, a fellow officer who'd watched Brian's fall and rise from the sidelines, found himself rattled. He'd been complicit in the silence, the shrugging off of "that's just how it is." Now, he questioned it all, pushing for change in his own quiet way. His bond with Brian evolved less about shared beers, more about shared purpose. Brian's journey wasn't a fairy tale ending or a grand redemption song. It was a messy, ongoing fight, a lesson in justice's slow burn and the ruin that comes from wielding power without care. And in that struggle, there was a fragile, stubborn hope for him, for Maya, for the community that something enduring could rise from the ashes of what had been. The sun dipped low over the sleepy town of Alderwood, Missouri, painting the sky with streaks of orange and gold as it slipped behind the jagged line of trees. Along Broad Street, long shadows stretched across the cracked pavement, reaching like ghostly fingers toward the patrol car where Officer Jake Hardin sat, one hand resting lazily on the steering wheel, the other drumming an impatient rhythm against the edge of his crackling radio. The hum of the streetlights, flickering to life, buzzed faintly in the background, blending with the distant chirping of crickets. Another night shift was unfolding, and to Jake, it felt like every other evening in this quiet corner of the world he'd sworn to protect. Alderwood was his domain, a place where he thrived on the sense of order he imposed, a fortress he guarded with an iron will. In his mind, he was the unyielding sentinel, the final barrier against chaos in a society he believed was teetering on the edge. Known for his no-nonsense approach, Jake prided himself on his ability to see through excuses, to enforce the rules with a steady hand. The townsfolk might whisper about his rigidity, but to him, that firmness was exactly what Alderwood needed, and he relished being the one to deliver it. As he cruised past the local convenience store, its neon sign buzzing faintly in the dusk, something snagged his attention. A little girl sat alone on a weathered wooden bench outside, her small frame dwarfed by the hulking storefront behind her. She couldn't have been more than 8 or 9, her legs swinging idly as she nibbled at a pack of crackers clutched in her tiny hands. Her pink dress, faded and fraying at the hem, clung to her like a relic of better days, and her dark curls were pulled back into a tidy ponytail that swayed with each nervous glance. She cast around her. Jake's eyes narrowed as he watched her from across the street, his patrol car rolling to a slow, deliberate stop. She looked out of place, vulnerable, her wide eyes darting as if she were hiding something or waiting for someone who wasn't coming. No adults lingered nearby, no watchful parent hovering to claim her. The scene gnawed at him, stirring the instincts he'd honed over years on the force. A child alone, clutching food near a store. What if she'd slipped inside and swiped it? He'd seen it before, kids testing boundaries, parents too distracted or absent to care. His fingers tightened around the steering wheel, a familiar surge of duty swelling in his chest. It was his job to maintain the peace, to nip trouble in the bud before it festered, and if that meant stepping in now, so be it. With a decisive grunt, Jake shoved open the door of his patrol car, the hinges creaking as his polished boots struck the pavement with a resolute thud. He straightened his broad shoulders, adjusting the weight of his badge as he strode toward the girl, his shadow stretching long and dark across the sidewalk. She looked up as he approached, her cracker crumbling slightly in her grip as his looming figure eclipsed the fading sunlight. Her eyes widened, pools of uncertainty reflecting the stern lines of his face. "Hey there," Jake said, his voice steady but laced with a subtle edge, the kind that demanded answers without inviting argument. "Where are your parents?" The girl swallowed hard, her small fingers tightening around the crinkled wrapper as if it were a lifeline. "My mom's inside," she murmured, her voice barely above a whisper, fragile against the weight of his presence. "She's shopping. She said I could wait here." Jake's gaze flicked toward the store's glass doors, where the evening rush had turned the place into a chaotic hive, shoppers pushing carts, children weaving through aisles, the muffled clamor spilling out into the night. No one seemed to be searching for her, no frantic mother calling her name. His eyes slid back to the crackers in her hands, and he tilted his head slightly. "Those crackers, did you pay for them?" The girl's breath hitched, her shoulders hunching as if his words had struck her. "My mom gave them to me," she stammered, her voice trembling now, a thread of panic weaving through it. "I didn't take anything, I promise." But Jake wasn't convinced. Her fidgeting hands, her quick glances toward the store, set off alarms in his mind. He'd been around too long to let a shaky explanation sway him, crossing his arms over his chest. He towered over her, his shadow swallowing her small form. "Let's be honest here," he pressed, his tone hardening like steel. "Did you take them from the store without paying?" Tears welled in her eyes, glistening in the dim light as she shook her head furiously. "No, sir," she whispered, her voice breaking. But Jake's mind was already made up, his judgment locked in place like the snap of a handcuff. He bent down, his calloused hand closing around her thin arm, pulling her up from the bench with a firm tug. "Come on," he said, his voice sharper now, cutting through the soft rustle of the evening breeze. "We'll wait for your mom inside. You can explain this to her there." The girl's sobs erupted, her small body trembling as she stumbled alongside him. "Please, I didn't do anything wrong," she cried, her words dissolving into hiccuping gasps. "My mom's coming back, I promise." Jake didn't loosen his grip, his boots thudding against the pavement as he marched her toward the store entrance. Her pleas bounced off him, drowned out by the certainty that he was in the right. His job wasn't about coddling or second-guessing, it was about enforcing order, no matter the cost. Passersby paused, their curious stares prickling the back of his neck, but he ignored them, his focus unwavering as he pushed through the glass doors. Inside, the store buzzed with life registers beeping, carts clattering, voices overlapping in a chaotic symphony. Caroline Grant stood near the back, her shopping list crumpled in her hand as she scanned the shelves. For the last few items on her mind, she was a single mother, her thoughts a tangle of dinner plans and unanswered work emails that loomed over her evening. A quick glance at her watch tightened her jaw. She was running out of time. But then, a ripple of commotion near the entrance jolted her from her thoughts. She looked up, and the world seemed to freeze. There, framed by the fluorescent glow, was her daughter, Mia, her small frame dwarfed by Jake's imposing figure as he gripped her arm. Tears streaked Mia's face, her pink dress wrinkled where she'd clutched it in fear. Caroline's heart plummeted, a cold wave of dread crashing over her as she abandoned her cart and rushed forward, her sneakers squeaking against the linoleum. She dropped to her knees before Mia, her hands trembling as she wiped the tears from her daughter's cheeks. "What's going on? What happened?" she demanded, her voice thick with a mother's instinct to shield. Mia flung herself into her mother's arms, her sobs muffled against Caroline's shoulder. "Mommy, I didn't do anything. The man thinks I stole the crackers." Caroline's gaze snapped upward, locking onto Jake with a fury that burned through her exhaustion. "She didn't steal anything," she said, her voice low and taut, each word a shard of ice. "I gave her those crackers. What do you think you're doing?" Jake straightened, unfazed, his jaw set like stone. "I saw a child sitting alone outside with snacks. She seemed nervous. I had reason to believe she might have taken them without paying." Caroline surged to her feet, her hands balling into fists at her sides, her entire body vibrating with rage. "You had no reason to lay a hand on my daughter," she snapped, her voice rising, sharp enough to slice through the hum of the store. "She's 9 years old. For God's sake, she was just waiting for me." A small crowd had begun to gather, drawn by the escalating tension. Shoppers lingered near the checkout, their whispers a soft undercurrent to the seen frowning in concern, others shaking their heads in quiet judgment. Jake felt their eyes boring into him, but he stood his ground, his chest puffing slightly as he met Caroline's glare. "Mum, I was following protocol," he said, his tone clipped, authoritative. "It's my duty to investigate suspicious behavior." Caroline's laugh was bitter, a jagged sound that cut through the air. "Suspicious?" she shouted, stepping closer, her fury a living thing. A little girl eating crackers her mother gave her. "Take your hand off my daughter right now. This is unacceptable." For the first time, a flicker of doubt crept into Jake's mind, a hairline crack in his certainty. He saw the terror in Mia's tear-streaked face, the raw anger in Caroline's trembling frame, the murmurs of the onlookers growing louder, more pointed. But admitting fault that wasn't in his nature. Instead, he tightened his resolve, doubling down. "Ma'am, I'm just doing my job," he insisted, though his voice faltered ever so slightly, betraying the unease beginning to churn beneath his bravado. Across town, months later, Ryan Elisa Mann, who'd once worn the same uniform as Jake, walked slowly through the park, where his own story had begun. The gravel crunched under his worn sneakers, the evening air cool against his skin as the city's hum mingled with the rustling leaves overhead. He paused by the winding trail, his breath catching as memories flooded back, not with the crushing shame they once carried, but with a bittersweet clarity. That day, years ago, he'd been the one in the wrong. his actions a stain he'd spent every day since trying to scrub clean. Some still doubted his transformation, their wary glances a reminder of the trust he'd shattered. And he didn't begrudge them that. Trust, he'd learned, wasn't a gift handed over, it was a garden cultivated through time. Through every choice he made to be better. Standing there, the wind tugging at his jacket, he felt the weight of his journey, a testament to how far he'd climbed and how much farther he still had to go. This wasn't just a tale of one man's reckoning. It was a mirror held up to the power of accountability, the slow grind of change, and the courage it took to fight for what was right. Maya Ellis, Brian's sister, had been the unyielding force who'd dragged him into the light, her determination not rooted in spite, but in a fierce hunger for justice. And justice, as Brian had come to understand, wasn't a lightning strike, it was a river carving its path through stone, relentless and patient. Jake Harden, too, would face that river. The moment with Mia and Caroline had planted a seed, one that would grow through sleepless nights and whispered doubts, forcing him to confront the man he'd become. His prejudice had blinded him, his power misused, and the consequences would ripple outward, shaking the foundation of everything he thought he knew. Justice wasn't just punishment, it was the chance to rebuild, to offer a path forward while holding the guilty accountable. For Jake, for Brian, for Mia and Caroline, it was a lesson etched in the raw, messy truth of their lives. Power unchecked breeds ruin, but redemption hard-won could light the way to something better. In the dim light of a small-town convenience store, a trembling little girl named Mia stood clutching the hem of her faded jacket, her wide eyes darting toward the door where she hoped her mother would soon appear. She was just a child, barely 8 years old, with a mop of unruly curls and a quiet innocence that clung to her like a fragile shield. Yet, to Jake, a local police officer with a stern jaw and a badge polished to a gleam, her presence sparked suspicion. He towered over her, his broad frame casting a shadow that swallowed her small figure. His voice clipped and sharp as he demanded to know why she was loitering. Mia's lips quivered, her heart pounding in her chest as she stammered something about waiting for her mom. But Jake's gaze remained cold, unyielding, as if he could see some hidden threat lurking beneath her fear. Outside, the scene began to draw a crowd. Shoppers paused mid-step, their curiosity piqued by the unfolding drama. One by one, phones emerged from pockets, their tiny screens glowing as they captured every tense moment. Jake felt the heat creeping up his neck, his face flushing a deep crimson as the weight of all those eyes bore down on him. He wasn't used to this being the center of attention, the one under scrutiny. His pride bristled, urging him to double down rather than retreat. "I'm just trying to keep this community safe," he snapped, his words slicing through the air like a blade, though they sounded hollow even to his own ears. He straightened his shoulders, determined to hold his ground, the murmur of the crowd buzzing in his head like a swarm of angry bees. But then came Caroline, Mia's mother, bursting through the store's glass doors with a look of raw panic etched across her face. Her dark hair was disheveled, her coat flapping open as she rushed toward her daughter. When she saw Jake looming over Mia, her breath caught in her throat, and her voice cracked with a mix of disbelief and fury. "Safe?" she echoed, her tone jagged with emotion. "By treating innocent children like criminals? My daughter isn't a threat to you or anyone else." Her words hung heavy in the air, each syllable trembling with the terror of a mother who'd momentarily lost sight of her child, only to find her in the grip of suspicion. She knelt beside Mia, brushing away the tears that streaked the girl's flushed cheeks, her hands shaking as she whispered, "It's okay, sweetie. I'm here now. You're safe." Mia clung to her mother's arm, her small body trembling as she buried her face in Caroline's shoulder, seeking refuge from the chaos. The crowd grew restless, their whispers turning into a low rumble. A voice, a sharp, indignant cry cut through the tension like a thunderclap. "This is wrong," someone shouted, their tone thick with outrage. "Let the kid go." Heads nodded in agreement, and the air seemed to tighten around Jake. He stood frozen, his hand still hovering near Mia's arm, the weight of judgment pressing in from every side. For the first time, a flicker of doubt pierced his resolve. Had he misread this entirely? Was this little girl, with her tearful eyes and quiet pleas, really the danger he'd imagined? His chest tightened as the store manager arrived, a weary man with thinning hair and a nervous gait, flanked by two employees who hovered awkwardly behind him. Their presence only amplified the scrutiny, and Jake's silence spoke louder than any defense he might have offered. With a reluctant sigh, he released Mia's arm, stepping back as if the ground beneath him had shifted. But the damage was already done. The air crackled with a palpable shift. The crowd's stares now carried a mix of disgust and pity, and Caroline's voice trembled with a fury born of both fear and betrayal. She rose to her feet, her eyes blazing like twin flames, and fixed Jake with a look that could have melted steel. "I'm filing a formal complaint against you," she said, her voice low and icy, each word deliberate and cutting. "This is unacceptable." Jake clenched his jaw, fighting to keep his composure, his knuckles whitening as he balled his fists. "You have the right to do that," he replied stiffly, his tone betraying none of the turmoil churning inside him. "But I was just doing my job." The words felt like ash in his mouth, a flimsy shield against the storm he'd unleashed. Caroline didn't dignify his excuse with a response. She turned on her heel, guiding Mia out of the store with a protective arm around her shoulders, leaving Jake standing alone in the fluorescent-lit aisle. The crowd dispersed slowly, their murmurs trailing behind them like echoes of condemnation. As the days crept by, Jake couldn't shake the unease that gnawed at him. He threw himself into his patrols, trying to drown out the memory of Mia's tear-streaked face, telling himself he'd been right, that he'd only been upholding order. But the whispers around town grew louder, a chorus of disapproval that followed him like a shadow. The image of that scared little girl haunted his quiet moments, her wide eyes staring back at him from the corners of his mind. It wasn't long before the consequences caught up with him. One gray morning, Jake found himself summoned to the police station, sitting across from the chief in a cold, sterile office that smelled faintly of stale coffee and disinfectant. The chief, a burly man with a graying mustache and a gaze that could bore through stone, leaned forward, his voice heavy with disappointment. "Jake, we've had a formal complaint filed against you. Racial profiling. A little girl. What were you thinking?" The words hit Jake like a sledgehammer, leaving his mouth dry and his thoughts scrambling. Racial profiling. That wasn't it, was it? It had been about protocol, about suspicion, not race. Or so he'd told himself. But the chief's stern expression offered no room for excuses. "You're suspended until further notice," he continued, his tone final. "There's an investigation underway. You'll attend sensitivity training, and depending on the outcome, there could be more consequences." Jake nodded, numb, as he stumbled out of the office, his world spinning. The badge pinned to his chest, once a symbol of purpose and control, now felt like a lead weight dragging him down. He'd always seen himself as the guardian of this town, the one who kept the chaos at bay. But now, that certainty was crumbling. The sensitivity training was supposed to be a formality, something he could grit his teeth through and move on. Yet, as the sessions unfolded, something began to shift inside him. The stories he hard-reel accounts of prejudice, of snap judgments gone wrong, started to echo uncomfortably in his memory. He thought of Mia, of the assumptions he'd made without a second thought. What if he'd been wrong? What if his instincts, the ones he'd trusted so blindly, were flawed? By the end of the training, Jake barely recognized the man he'd been when he walked in. He'd been forced to stare into a mirror he'd avoided for years, confronting the biases and arrogance he'd buried beneath his badge. But the real test came when his suspension required him to volunteer at the local community center, a place he'd never set foot in before. Jake wasn't the type to mingle with the people he policed. His job was to enforce, not to connect. Yet here he was, stepping through the doors of the food bank in civilian cloth, a faded jacket and jeans that felt foreign against his skin, his broad shoulders hunched as if he could shrink into himself. The moment he crossed the threshold, his eyes locked onto a familiar face, Caroline, standing behind the serving counter, ladling soup into bowls for a line of families that stretched out the door. Beside her was Mia, her small hands carefully arranging trays, a tentative smile lighting her face. Jake's heart sank like a stone. Caroline spotted him too, her expression hardening into a mask of steel as recognition flashed in her eyes. She didn't speak, but her body language screamed voluminous, her shoulders squared, her arm instinctively drawing Mia closer. The message was unmistakable. You're not welcome here. Jake averted his gaze, grabbing a stack of boxes and retreating to the back of the room. He spent the day in silence, hauling and goods and sweeping the floor. The guilt a constant ache in his chest. Days turned into weeks, and he kept returning, driven by a quiet hope that his actions might prove he wasn't the monster they saw. Little by little, the community began to reveal itself to him not as a faceless mass to be policed, but as a tapestry of lives woven with struggle, resilience, and quiet dignity. One afternoon, as he stacked boxes in the storeroom, Jake overheard two volunteers chatting nearby. "Caroline and Mia, they've been helping out here for years," one said, her voice warm with admiration. Caroline started after her mom passed, wanted to give back, and Mia's always tagging along. "Sweet kid, smart as anything." The words stopped Jake cold, his hands freezing mid-motion. Mia, the little girl he'd accused of theft, the child he'd restrained without a second thought, was a fixture here, helping, giving, serving. The realization crashed over him like a tidal wave, his breath catching as guilt twisted his gut. He'd been so wrong, so horribly wrong. His hands trembled as he set the box down, his mind replaying every detail of that day in the store, every assumption he'd clung to like gospel. That night, alone in his cramped apartment, Jake sat in the dark, the faint glow of a streetlight seeping through the blinds. He stared at the blank wall, his thoughts a tangled storm he couldn't quiet. For years, he'd walked these streets believing he was their protector, the one who drew the line between right and wrong. But now, he wondered if he'd ever truly known the people he claimed to serve. Life wasn't the black and white picture he'd painted: good versus evil, order versus chaos. It was messy, human, layered with stories he'd never bothered to hear. The chair scraped against the floor as he stood abruptly, grabbing his jacket and heading for the door, driven by a restless need to escape the weight of his own mind. The next day, he returned to the community center, steeling himself for what he might find. Caroline and Mia were there again, their smiles bright as they served the line of waiting families. Jake swallowed hard, the knot of guilt tightening in his chest. He couldn't keep running from this, had to face it, to own the consequences of what he'd done. He grabbed a broom and started sweeping, keeping his head low, but his eyes kept drifting to them. The way Caroline guided Mia with a gentle hand, the way Mia giggled as she handed out roast higher bond was a quiet strength, a testament to everything he'd misjudged. In that moment, Jake understood the true cost of his actions, the ripple effect of power wielded without care. Justice wasn't just about enforcing rules, it was about seeing people, really seeing them, and he'd failed at that in the worst way. The lesson sank deep, a bitter but necessary truth. Unchecked authority could wound far more than it protected, and the road to redemption was long, uncertain, and entirely his to walk. The flicker of joy that danced across Mia's face whenever she brought a smile to someone else was impossible to miss. For her, this wasn't just an act of kindness or a fleeting moment of charity, it was a lifeline, a way to weave herself into the fabric of the people around her, to give back something tangible after all she'd endured. Her small hands moved with purpose, handing out sandwiches or folding blankets, her eyes bright with a quiet determination that made her seem older than her years. She didn't say much, but her presence carried a warmth that filled the community center, a subtle glow that drew people in without them even realizing it. Jake, on the other hand, stood off to the side, his broom idle in his hands as his gaze dropped to the scuffed wooden floor. His mind churned like a storm-tossed sea, waves of regret crashing against the rocky shores of his conscience. He had to fix this, knew that muck, but the path forward felt shrouded in fog. An apology lingered on his tongue, bitter and inadequate, like a coin too worn to hold any value. What could he possibly say to undo the damage he'd caused? The weight of his mistake pressed down on him, a heavy mantle he couldn't shake off. And every time he tried to think his way out, his thoughts looped back to the same helpless question: what now? Before he could wrestle an answer from the chaos in his head, a shadow fell across his boots. Officer Hardin. Caroline's voice cut through the haze, steady and measured, though it carried an edge of authority that made Jake's stomach twist. She stood before him, her face a mask of calm resolve. Her arms crossed tightly over her chest like a shield. "Can we talk?" It wasn't a question so much as a command, and Jake's heart thudded painfully against his ribs. He nodded, setting the broom against the wall with trembling hands. "Of course," he murmured, his voice so soft it barely reached his own ears, let alone hers. She didn't hesitate, leading him through the bustling main room of the center past the chatter of volunteers, the clatter of dishes, the hum of lives intersecting and into a cramped, dimly lit storage room at the back. The door clicked shut behind them, sealing out the noise and leaving only the thick silence that stretched between them. Caroline turned to face him, her posture unyielding, her eyes sharp and searching. "I know why you're here," she said, her tone unwavering, each word landing like a stone in still water. "You're trying to make up for what you did to Mia. I see the effort, and I'm not blind to it. But I need to hear it from you, Jake. Do you even understand what you did wrong?" Her words hit him like a punch to the gut, and for a moment, he couldn't breathe. The air in the room felt too thin, too heavy with the truth he'd been dodging. He sucked in a ragged breath, forcing himself to meet her gaze as his thoughts scrambled for footing. "I messed up," he started, his voice quaking like a leaf in the wind. "I saw Mia that day, sitting by herself on that bench, and I didn't think. I just assumed the worst. I thought she was trouble, up to something shady, and I didn't even pause to consider the truth. She tried to tell me, tried to explain, but I wouldn't hear it. I let my own garbagemy biases, my snap judgments take over, and I hurt her. I hurt you both." He paused, his throat tight, his hands clenching into fists at his sides as the shame washed over him in waves. Caroline didn't flinch, didn't soften, but she didn't stop him either, her silence a canvas for him to paint his confession across. "I was wrong, Caroline," he pressed on, desperation creeping into his voice. "So damn wrong. I know words don't erase what I did, they don't magically fix the pain I caused, but I'm sorry. I've been replaying it in my head every single day, every night, and it's eating me alive. I don't want to be that guy, the officer who jumps to conclusions, the person who fails people like Mia. I need you to know I'm trying to be better." The room fell quiet, the air thick with the echo of his words. Jake stood there, exposed and raw, his pulse hammering in his ears as he waited for her to respond. When she finally spoke, her voice was softer, though no less firm, like a blade wrapped in velvet. "I appreciate that you're being straight with me," she said, her eyes still locked on his. "But I'm not the one you need to apologize to. It's Mia who deserves to hear this." Jake swallowed hard, the lump in his throat nearly choking him. "I know," he rasped. "I'll tell her too. But what else can I do? How do I make this right?" Caroline studied him for what felt like an eternity, her gaze peeling back layers he didn't even know he had. At last, she exhaled, a slow, deliberate sigh that seemed to carry the weight of her own struggles. "Words are cheap, Officer Harden," she said, her tone sharpening again. "If you want to make this right, prove it. Show us you've changed. Keep showing up here. Keep putting in the work. That's how you start to mend what you broke." Jake nodded, a strange cocktail of relief and guilt swirling in his chest. He hadn't expected her to forgive him, didn't deserve it, not yet, but this sliver of a chance, this lifeline she was tossing him, felt like more than he'd dared to hope for. Over the next few weeks, Jake threw himself into that chance with everything he had. Every day, he hauled himself to the community center, his boots crunching against the gravel lot as the sun crept over the horizon. He swept floors, stacked boxes, carried bags of donated clothes waiter needed doing. He did it, his hands moving with a quiet purpose he hadn't felt in years. He kept his head down, staying out of the way, but his eyes always drifted to Mia and Caroline. Mia, with her boundless energy and shy smiles, darted around the center like a firefly, lighting up the dim corners. Caroline, ever watchful, moved with a steady grace, her presence a pillar holding the place together. Jake hadn't mustered the courage to face Mia yet. The thought of it twisted his gut into nacho. Could he look into those wide, trusting eyes and ask for forgiveness he hadn't earned? But he was resolute, determined to prove himself through action, to let his sweat and silence speak for him until the right moment came. As the days stretched into weeks, he began to notice a shift. At first, the people at the center had eyed him warily, their glances sharp and guarded. their voices dropping to hushed tones when he passed by. But slowly, almost imperceptibly, the tension eased. The suspicious stares softened into nods of acknowledgement, and then, tentatively, into greetings. A grizzled old man with a limp stopped him one day to ask about his weekend. A young mother juggling the kids flashed him a tired smile as he held the door for her. Little by little, the walls came down. One humid afternoon, as Jake wrestled with a stubborn stack of canned goods in the pantry, a small shadow fell across the shelves. He turned, and there she was, Mia, her hands clasped behind her back, her sneakers scuffing the floor as she shifted nervously. His heart lurched into his throat, a frantic drumbeat drowning out the world. This was the moment he'd been dreading, the moment he'd been yearning for. "Hi," she said, her voice a soft thread of sound, her eyes wide with a mix of curiosity and caution. Jake set the box down with deliberate care and crouched to her level, his knees creaking, his breath catching. "Hi, Mia," he replied, keeping his tone gentle, like he was coaxing a skittish bird. She rocked on her heels, her gaze flickering between him and the floor. "Mom said you're here to help," she ventured after a beat, her words careful, testing. Jake nodded. A small, earnest movement. "That's right, I'm here to help," Mia bit her lip, her brow furrowing as she wrestled with something inside. Then, lifting her eyes to meet Histo's huge, unguarded eyes that had haunted his sleepless nights, whispered, "Are you really sorry for what you did?" The question pierced him, sharp and clean, and his chest tightened with a flood of emotion he couldn't name. He swallowed, his throat raw, and nodded again. "Yes, Mia," he said, his voice thick and unsteady. "I'm so sorry. I didn't listen to you when I should have. I didn't treat you the way you deserved. And I hate that I hurt you. I'm sorry." She stared at him, her face a blank slate, unreadable in a way that made his stomach churn. Seconds stretched into forever, and then, slowly, she nodded. "Okay," she said, her voice barely audible. "I forgive you." The words hit him like a gust of wind, knocking the air from his lungs. He blinked, stunned, unprepared for the grace she'd just handed him. Forgiveness from Mia, of all people, felt like a gift he hadn't earned. A weight lifting from his shoulders he hadn't even known he was carrying. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice cracking. "Thank you, Mia." She gave him a tiny, hesitant smile, then turned and skipped back to Caroline, her ponytail bouncing with each step. Jake watched her go, a strange peace settling over him, fragile but real. He wasn't done in it by a long shot, but this felt like a beginning. That moment marked a turning point, though Jake didn't fully grasp it then. His time at the center didn't end with Mia's forgiveness, it deepened. He started listening, really listening to the people around him. There was Mr. Torres, the weary old man with the limp, who told Jake about losing his job after a factory closed 20 years back. His gravelly voice tinged with pride as he spoke of raising 3 kids on nothing but grit. There was Lena, the young mother, whose quick smiles hid the exhaustion of working 2 jobs while her husband was overseas. Jake soaked in their stories, their struggles, and slowly, the world he'd once viewed through a narrow lens cracked open wide. He saw how much he'd missed, how many people he'd misjudged, how his power could wound when wielded carelessly. One crisp morning, as Jake hauled crates for a food drive, Caroline approached, a clipboard tucked under her arm. "Officer Hardin," she said, a faint smile tugging at her lips, softening the edges of her usual steel. "I think it's time we kicked things up a notch." Jake arched a brow, wiping sweat from his forehead. "What do you mean?" She handed him the clipboard, her fingers brushing his with a casual ease that belied the weight of her words. "We're planning a community outreach event, a big one. Residents, police, everyone together. It's about building bridges, showing we're all in this together, and we want you to help run it." Jake stared at the papers in his hands, a jumble of notes and schedules, his heart swelling with something dangerously close to pride. "Me?" he asked, disbelief coloring his tone. "You're sure?" Caroline nodded, her eyes steady. "You've been putting in the work, Jake. You've shown us you mean it. This is your next step." Gratitude surged through him, fierce and unexpected. This wasn't just redemption, it was purpose, a chance to reshape the legacy of his badge. He grinned. "A rare, unguarded thing. I'm in," he said, his voice firm. "Let's make it happen." The weeks that followed were a whirlwind. Jake dove into the planning, his days a blur of phone calls, meetings, and late-night strategy sessions with Caroline and a ragtag crew of volunteers. There was Sam, a lanky teenager with a sharp wit and a knack for logistics, who kept the group laughing even when tensions ran high. There was Mrs. Patel, a stern widow with a soft spot for organizing chaos, who bustled around with a clipboard of her own, barking orders in a tone that brooked no argument. Together, they hashed out activity schemes for the kids, a potluck, even a Q&A with the cops, and Jake reached out to his precinct, coaxing reluctant officers to join in. He knew the mistrust ran deep, a river carved by years of missteps, but he was hell-bent on damming it, one brick at a time. The day of the event dawned bright and clear, the park alive with a buzz that vibrated through the air. Families spilled across the grass, their laughter mingling with the smell of grilled hot dogs and fresh-cut lawn. Kids raced around, shrieking as they chased balloons, while adults clustered in small groups, some wary, some hopeful. Jake moved through the crowd, shaking hands, trading small talk, feeling for the first time in years like he belonged. Near the dunk tank, a line of giggling kids formed, and at the front stood Mia, her eyes glinting with mischief as she hefted a ball. She aimed, threw, and with a splash, Officer Daniels went under, the crowd erupting in cheers. Jake laughed, a deep, unguarded sound, watching her beam with triumph. As the sun dipped low, painting the sky in streaks of orange and pink, Jake stood back, taking it all in. This was a lesson etched into his bones. Justice wasn't just about enforcing rules, it was about accountability, about facing the consequences of your actions and building something better from the wreckage. Power, misused, could fracture trust, but wielded with care, it could heal. Mia's laughter rang out again, sharp and clear, and Jake knew he'd never forget it. He'd stumbled, fallen hard, but here, amid the mess and the mending, he'd found his way back. The sky glowed with a gentle orange hue as the sun dipped lower, casting a warm blanket of light over the sprawling park. Laughter rippled through the air, weaving itself into the joyful cacophony of children darting across the grass in playful pursuit, their sneakers kicking up tufts of earth. Nearby, parents clustered around weathered picnic tables, their voices rising and falling in animated conversation, cups of lemonade sweating in their hands. The community picnic had unfolded into something extraordinarier, exceeding the modest hopes Jake had nursed when the idea first took root. As he wove through the bustling crowd, his boots crunching against the gravel path, he couldn't help but marvel at the scene before him. People he'd once regarded as distant figures, faceless names in a small-town ledger now, mingled freely with officers and volunteers, their smiles bright and unguarded. The heavy tension that had once clung to this place like a stubborn fog had vanished, replaced by an easy camaraderie that felt almost miraculous. From the corner of his eye, he caught sight of Mia bounding toward him, her curly hair bouncing wildly with each eager step, her grin stretched wide across her freckled face, a beacon of pure, unfiltered joy that hit Jake like a gust of fresh air. For a fleeting moment, his chest tightened with a swell of emotion, pride, relief, and something softer he couldn't quite name. After all the missteps, the guilt, the long nights questioning himself, this was the heartbeat of it all. Trust rebuilt, laughter shared, connections forged. Mia skidded to a halt in front of him, her breath coming in quick bursts as she beamed up at him. "You did it, Jake," she exclaimed, her voice bubbling over with excitement, as if she'd just uncovered a secret treasure. "You really helped make all this happen." Jake let out a low chuckle, shaking his head as he rubbed the back of his neck, a faint flush creeping up his cheeks. "Nah, kid," he said, his tone light but laced with humility. "I just pitched in where I could. It was your mom and all these other folks who turned it into something special." Mia tilted her head, wiping a bead of sweat from her brow with the back of her hand, her eyes gleaming with that stubborn spark he'd come to recognize. "But you're part of it too," she insisted, her words firm and bright. "That's what Mom says. She says you've been doing a really good job." For a heartbeat, Jake's smile wavered, his gaze dropping to meet hers. Those words, simple, earnest, pierced him deeper than he'd expected. Not so long ago, the same girl had flinched at the sight of him, her small frame trembling under the weight of fear and mistrust. He could still see it in his mind's eye, the glint of handcuffs, the sharp edge of his own voice, the way he'd let his assumptions cloud his judgment. He'd been so wrong about her, and the shame of it had haunted him ever since. Yet here she stood, not just forgiving him but lifting him up with her boundless grace. It was a gift he felt unworthy of, a second chance he hadn't dared to hope for. Bending down to her level, he rested a hand on his knee, his voice softening to a near whisper. "Thanks, Mia," he said, the words thick with gratitude. "That means more to me than you'll ever know." Mia giggled, her energy snapping back like a rubber band as she grabbed his hand, tugging him forward with all the strength her small frame could muster. "Come on, Jake, I want to show you the face painting booth. Mom's over there with the other volunteers." Rising to his feet, he brushed the grass from his jeans, letting her lead him across the park. The air buzzed with life kids squealing as they darted between tables, the faint strumming of a guitar from somewhere near the oak trees, the smoky scent of barbecue drifting on the breeze. As they neared the booth, Jake's eyes landed on Caroline, her silhouette framed against the fading light. She was deep in conversation with a group of mothers, her hands gesturing animatedly as she spoke, her face glowing with the quiet triumph of a day well orchestrated. Spotting Jake and Mia, she raised a hand in a cheerful wave, beckoning them closer. "You're just in time," Caroline called out, her voice carrying a playful lilt as they approached. "I was about to volunteer you for the dunk tank again." Jake laughed, the sound rumbling up from his chest as he shook his head. "I think I've taken enough plunges for one day," he replied, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "But if it keeps the kids grinning, I'll climb back up there." Caroline arched an eyebrow, her lips twitching into a teasing smile. "Oh, don't tempt them," she warned, her tone light but knowing. "They'll have you soaked before you can blink." For a moment, they stood side by side, watching as Mia scampered off to join her friends, her laughter trailing behind her like a melody. The silence between them was comfortable, a stark contrast to the brittle exchanges that had once defined their encounters. Gone was the crackling resentment, the unspoken accusations that had hung heavy in the air. In its place was something new, a quiet alliance, a mutual recognition of the work they'd both put in to reach this point. Caroline's gaze swept over the crowd, her expression softening as she took it all in. "I never thought I'd see a day like this," she murmured, her voice barely audible over the hum of the picnic. "It's been a long road." Jake nodded, his mind drifting back through the tangle of memories that had brought them here. He could still feel the sting of his own failurist snap judgments, the weight of his badge wielded carelessly, the nights he'd lain awake replaying every mistake. But he'd clawed his way out of that darkness, determined to earn back what he'd broken. "It has," he agreed, his tone steady but reflective. "But we're here now. That's what counts." Caroline turned to him, her eyes searching his face with a quiet intensity. "You've changed, Jake," she said, her words deliberate, as if she'd been holding them back for a while. "I didn't believe it at first. I thought you were just putting on a show, trying to smooth things over so we'd all forget what happened. But I see it now, you were not the same man who put my daughter in handcuffs." Her words landed like a stone in his chest, heavy and unyielding. He swallowed hard, the memory of that day flashing vivid and raw. Mia's wide, frightened eyes, the cold metal against her wrists, the way his own certainty had crumbled when he realized his error. "I'm not," he admitted, his voice rough with honesty. "Or at least, I'm trying not to be. I've messed up a lot in my life, Crolin more times than I can count. But what happened with Mia, that shook me to my core. It forced me to look at myself, really look. And I didn't like what I saw. I'm still figuring it out, and I probably will be for a long time." A faint smile tugged at Caroline's lips, her gaze softening with something close to understanding. "We're all figuring it out," she said gently. "None of us have all the answers. But what matters is that you're here, showing up every day, putting in the effort. That's not nothing, Jake." Her words hung between them, a lifeline he hadn't known he needed. Praise wasn't something he was used to, especially not from Hersimeon, who'd had every reason to turn her back on him. Yet here she was, offering him not just forgiveness but trust. "Thank you," he said, his voice low and thick with emotion. "Coming from you, that means everything." She nodded, holding his gaze for a moment longer before turning back to the picnic, her posture easing as she surveyed the scene. After a pause, she spoke again, her tone shifting to something more tentative. There's something I've been meaning to bring up. Jake raised an eyebrow, curiosity flickering in his chest. Oh, what's that? Caroline hesitated, her fingers fidgeting with the edge of her sleeve as she chose her words. The food bank, she said at last, her voice steadying. We've been running it for years, but it's getting harder to keep up. The need around here is growing faster than we can manage. I was wondering if you'd be interested in helping out more, not just dropping by when you can, but really stepping in. We could use someone like you, someone who gets this community, who cares about it. The offer caught him off guard, his breath hitching as he processed it. Jake had never pictured himself as a pillar of anything. His life had been defined by the crisp lines of law and order, the black and white clarity of his role as an officer. But standing here, surrounded by the heartbeat of this town, kids laughing, neighbors sharing stories, the air thick with possibility, felt a shift. I'd be honored, he said, his voice firm with resolve. Whatever you need, I'm in. Caroline's face lit up with a warm, genuine smile, her eyes glinting with approval. Good, she said simply. We could use someone with your skills and your heart. The words settled over him like a mantle, igniting a spark of pride he hadn't felt in years. For the first time in a long while, Jake sensed he was part of something greater than himself, something that pulsed with purpose. In the weeks that followed, Jake threw himself into the food bank with a quiet determination. He spent long afternoons sorting canned goods, their metal edges cool against his palms, and evenings coordinating deliveries, his truck rumbling down dusty backroads to drop off supplies. He haggled with local shop owners, his voice steady but earnest, securing donations of bread and produce to stretch their resources further. The transformation was gradual but undeniable. Wasn't just Officer Hardin anymore, the stern figure in a pressed uniform who'd once patrolled these streets with a detached air. He was Jake now, a man carving out a new path, stitching together the trust he'd frayed with every box he packed, every hand he shook. His fellow officers took notice too. At the station, whispers about Jake's newfound passion filtered through the break room, mingling with the clatter of coffee mugs and the hum of radios. Some rolled their eyes at first, dismissing it as a phase, a bid for redemption that wouldn't last. But others watched with growing curiosity, their skepticism softening as they saw the change in him, the way his shoulders no longer carried that rigid edge, the way his eyes lit up when he talked about the picnic or the food bank. Slowly, a few joined him, showing up in jeans and t-shirts to haul crates or stack shelves, their laughter echoing through the cramped storage room. One afternoon, as Jake finished loading a delivery van, Officer Maya Rodriguez sauntered over, her arms crossed and a smirk tugging at her lips. The sun beat down on the cracked asphalt, heat shimmering in waves around them. Gotta hand it to you, Hardin, she said, her tone teasing but warm. I didn't peg you for the community hero type. Jake chuckled, wiping sweat from his brow with the back of his hand. What? You thought I'd stick to writing tickets forever? He shot back, a grin playing at the corners of his mouth. Maya leaned against the van, her dark hair glinting in the sunlight. You were always the rule book guy, straight edges, no bends. Didn't think you'd be the one getting elbow deep in canned goods and charity drives. Her words carried a playful jab, but there was a flicker of respect beneath them. He shrugged, his smile fading into something more thoughtful. People can change, Maya. Sometimes they just need a push to see what's worth fighting for. She studied him for a moment, then laughed, shaking her head. Yeah, well, you're full of surprises these days. And it's working. Some of the guys are talking about pitching in. You might be onto something here. Thanks, he said, his voice quiet but firm. But it's not about me. It's about the people we're here for. Maya's smirk softened into a real smile, her eyes narrowing with a newfound regard. I hear you, she said, and I respect it. Keep it up, Jake. We could use more like you round here. As she walked off, her boots scuffing against the pavement, Jake stood there, the weight of her words sinking in. He thought back to the man he'd been months, agabrittle, unyielding, blind to the ripple effects of his choices. Justice, he'd learned, wasn't just about enforcing rules, it was about accountability. about facing the consequences of power misused and making amends with every step forward. The road ahead was long, but for the first time, he felt steady on it, rooted in a purpose that stretched beyond himself. Jake Hardin could hardly believe the path his life had taken. Standing in the heart of Alderwood, a small town where the leaves were just beginning to turn gold with the whisper of autumn, he felt a swell of pride and humility ripple through him. Once, he had pictured himself as a figure of authoritism respected not just for his badge and his ability to uphold the law, but for the way he poured his heart into the people around him. That realization hit him like a quiet wave, stirring a deep sense of purpose he hadn't known he could feel. It wasn't loud or boastful. It was steady, grounding, like the roots of the old oaks lining the town square. The following week, on a crisp Sunday evening, Caroline and her daughter Mia opened their home to him. Jake stood on their porch, his boots scuffing lightly against the weathered wood, a nervous flutter dancing in his chest. Gratitude mingled with unease as he clutched a small bouquet of wildflowers. He'd picked up on the anything fancy, just a gesture. He hadn't expected this invitation, not after the incident that had once cast a shadow between them. Yet here he was, teetering on the edge of something more than just a shared meal, something that felt like redemption. The door swung open, and Caroline's warm smile greeted him, instantly softening the knot in his stomach. "Come on in," she said, her voice as inviting as the glow spilling from the house. "Dinner's almost ready." Stepping inside, Jake inhaled the rich aroma of roasted vegetables and fresh bread, the kind of smell that wrapped around you like a memory. The house itself was a patchwork of lived-in comfort-faded cushions on the sofa, a scattering of Mia's toys across the floor, and a faint sound of her giggles echoing from the next room. "You've got a nice place," Jake remarked, his eyes tracing the walls adorned with family photos and little hand-drawn pictures. Caroline's smile widened, a flicker of pride lighting her face. "Thanks, it's home." Dinner unfolded around a sturdy oak table, the kind that had seen years of laughter and spilled milk. Mia, her small frame perched on a chair with a booster seat, chattered nonstop, her words tumbling over each other in her excitement. "I like science best," she declared, her eyes wide as she told Jake about her teacher's latest experiment with baking soda volcanoes. "And my friend Sarish's got this cool lizard at home," Caroline chimed in, her voice softer but no less animated, recounting her day at the food bank, where she worked tirelessly to keep the shelves stocked for those in need. Jake listened, really listened, feeling the threads of connection weave tighter with every story shared. The clink of forks against plates and the occasional burst of Mia's laughter filled the room, a symphony of normalcy he hadn't realized he'd been craving. As dessert, a warm apple crumble that melted on the tongue drew to a close, Caroline leaned back in her chair, her expression shifting to something more contemplative. The candlelight on the table flickered, casting soft shadows across her face. "You know," she began, her voice low and deliberate, "I've been thinking a lot about that day at the store." Jake's stomach clenched, a cold jolt racing through him at the memory. He stayed silent, letting her words unfold. "I was so angry with you," she continued, her gaze steady but not accusing. "The way you grabbed Mia, the way you assumed the worsty didn't think I could ever let that go. And honestly, there's still a piece of me that's mad, that remembers how small and scared she looked." Jake nodded, his throat tight. He didn't flinch from her honesty. He couldn't. He'd seen the fear in Mia's eyes that day, felt the weight of his mistake like a stone in his chest. "But then I look at you now," Caroline said, her eyes locking with his, "and I see the effort you've put in, the way you've thrown yourself into this community. It's made me realize people can change. You've shown us that." The words hit Jake hard, a rush of emotion swelling behind his ribs. He swallowed, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know if I deserve your forgiveness, Caroline, but I'm damn well going to keep trying to earn it." Her lips curved into a small, gentle smilione that carried a quiet strength, a depth of understanding he couldn't quite grasp. "You already have, Jake," she said softly. "You already have." Those words lingered in the air, heavier than the meal they'd just shared. And for the first time in a long while, Jake felt a flicker of hope that maybe, just maybe, he could be more than his worst moment. Weeks stretched into months, and Jake's presence in Alderwood grew roots. He became a fixture at the food bank, stacking cans with a rhythm that matched the volunteers' chatter. At the park, he'd toss a football with kids who once darted away at the sight of his uniform. Local Evans fundraisers, picnics, even the occasional movie night under the stars found him there. Sleeves rolled up, a smile tugging at his lips. People who used to cross the street to avoid him now waved with genuine warmth, their voices carrying a familiarity that hadn't been there before. Kids who once saw him as a stern enforcer now ran up to him, tugging at his arm to show off a new toy or a scraped knee. But the real transformation was inside Jake. He'd learned to listen not just to hear, but to feel the weight of people's words, to understand the fears that kept them up at night, the struggles that wore them down, the dreams they tucked away. The world wasn't black and white anymore. It was a tapestry of grays, woven with the messy, beautiful threads of human lives. Empathy, he realized, wasn't weakness, it was the backbone of justice. One crisp afternoon, as Jake strolled through the town square, the crunch of fallen leaves under his boots, he caught snippets of a conversation drifting from a nearby bench. Two teenagers lounged there, their hoodies slung low, talking about the community cleanup event Jake had helped organize with the local youth group. "That Officer Hardin guy," one of them said, his voice tinged with surprise. "He's actually pretty cool. My little brother was sick last week, and Hardin showed up at our door with a bag of groceries. Can you believe that?" The other teen nodded, kicking a pebble with his sneaker. "Yeah, he's been at the food bank forever now. I heard he's the one who kicked off that outreach thing with the cops." Jake kept walking, a quiet smile spreading across his face, his chest light with something he couldn't name. This was the work that mattered, not just keeping order, but building something real, something lasting. A community where people had each other's backs, where trust wasn't just demanded but earned, where second chances weren't just words but actions. The seasons turned, painting Alderwood in hues of amber and frost, and Jake felt the shift within himself deepen. It wasn't just the hours he logged at the food bank or the way the townsfolk greeted him now, without that wary edge. It was Mia's smile, bright, unguarded, and full of a warmth that stopped him in his tracks every time. That smile had become his compass, a measure of how far he'd climbed from the man he'd been. But he wasn't naive. Trust was a fragile thing, and the shadow of his past day he'd yanked Mia from that bench. Blinded by his own assumption still loomed, a reminder of how quickly power could bruise. He carried that weight, not as a burden, but as a lesson carved into his bones. Justice without heart was just force dressed up in a uniform. The community outreach program blossomed beyond his wildest hopes. What started as a modest food drive swelled into a web of monthly events cleanups that left the streets gleaming, mentoring sessions where kids swapped stories with cops over pizza, workshops where officers and residents sat across from each other, voices raw and real. The tension that once crackled through Alderwood like static began to fade, not all at once, but in small, steady steps. One Saturday, as Jake packed up supplies after a youth workshop, stacking folding chairs with a satisfying clatter, he spotted Officer Tom Landry across the park. Tom, with his broad shoulders and perpetual scowl, had been the loudest skeptic when Jake first pitched his ideas, sneering at what he called soft policing. But there he was, crouched down, talking to a cluster of teens, his gruff voice softened by a rare patience. Jake watched, a grin tugging at his lips, as Tom laughed a short, barking sound at something one of the kids said. Catching Jake's eye, Tom waved him over. "Hey, Hardin," he called, his tone lighter than Jake had ever heard it. "Come meet these kids. They're full of ideas for the next cleanup." Jake ambled over, still marveling at the change not just in himself, but in Tom. In the air between them all, Corey, a lanky teen with a backward baseball cap and a grin that stretched ear to ear, greeted him with a mock salute. "Officer Jake, we were just telling Landry here we want to do a basketball tournament next month. Cops versus us, Ewan." Jake chuckled, rubbing the back of his neck. "Only if you promise to go easy on us old guys." Corey's laugh rang out, sharp and bright. "Nah, we're taking you down." The banter flowed, easy and unforced, a far cry from the walls that once stood between them. It wasn't perfect, nothing ever was, but it was progress, and that was enough. Later that evening, As Jake sat on his porch, the night wrapping around him like a cool blanket, he let his mind wander. He wasn't the same man who'd misjudged Mia that day, who'd let his badge blind him to the people behind it. Facing his own flaws had been a jagged, painful road, but it had cracked him open, forced him to see the world anew. His phone buzzed, pulling him from his thoughts. A message from Caroline glowed on the screen. "Hey Jake, I wanted to thank you again for today. The kids really look up to you, and I know Mia does too. I don't think I ever told you this, but she's been talking about wanting to be a police officer when she grows up. She says she wants to help people like you do." Jake stared at the words, his breath catching. Mia, a cop, after everything, after the fear he'd caused her, thought that she saw him as a hero, not a villain, felt like a gift he hadn't earned. His fingers hovered over the keys, emotion choking his reply. "That means more than you know. Caroline, tell her I'd be proud to see her wear the badge someday." He hit send, leaned back, and let the quiet of the night settle over him. A man remade by the consequences of his past and the promise of what he could still become. Jake's fingers quivered ever so slightly as he typed out his response, the faint tremor betraying the storm of emotions swirling within him. "Caroline, thank you," he wrote, pausing to let the words linger on the screen before continuing. "That means more to me than you could ever imagine. Mia's an extraordinary girl full of fire and potential. She's going to leave her mark on this world, no matter what path she chooses." He hit send, his chest tightening with a mix of gratitude and disbelief. Moments later, his phone buzzed again, and Caroline's next message appeared almost instantly, as if she'd been waiting to pour out her thoughts. "She's lucky to have someone like you in her life, Jake. We all are." The words hit him like a quiet thunderclap. Jake didn't reply right away. He sat there, frozen in the dim glow of his living room, the phone resting in his lap as he stared at the screen. His hazel eyes traced the letters over and over, letting their meaning seep into the cracks of his weary soul. For years, he'd been clawing his way out of the shadows of his past, every misstep, every regret. Every time he'd wielded his authority like a blunt instrument instead of a shield. He'd spent so long trying to prove he was more than the sum of his failures, desperate to show the world and himself that he could be better. But now, sitting in the stillness, something clicked. Caroline's words weren't just kindness, they were a mirror. He didn't need to keep scrambling for redemption. He'd already earned their trust. He'd already bared his true self, flawed, earnest, and human, and they'd embraced him for it. For the first time in what felt like forever, a flicker of pride warmed his chest, tentative but real. Weeks later, the streets of Alderwood buzzed with life as the community threw its grandest celebration yet, a block party that sprawled across several blocks, pulling in hundreds of residents like moths to a flame. The air thrummed with the upbeat strums of a local band, the scent of grilled burgers and sweet funnel cakes wafting through the crowd. Children darted between makeshift game stations, their laughter piercing the hum of conversation, while adults clustered around picnic tables, swapping stories over cold drinks. For Jake, standing near a food stall with a paper plate of nachos in hand, it was more than a party, it was a revelation. He watched as families mingled with uniformed officers, their exchanges filled with genuine warmth. Laughter spilled freely where suspicion once reigned, as if the invisible walls that had long separated the police from the people they swore to protect had crumbled overnight. Across the bustling scene, Officer Tom Landry, a burly man with a booming laugh and a soft spot for kidstoast of football, with a group of boys, his deep voice coaxing them into playful tackles. Nearby, Officer Maya Rodriguez knelt beside a cluster of teenagers, her dark hair tied back as she guided their hands across a mural, taking shape on the side of a weathered building. Paint smudged her sleeves, but her grin was wide, her patience endless as she encouraged their creativity. Everywhere Jake turned, he saw it, connection, understanding, and a fragile, beautiful thread of hope weaving through the crowd. This wasn't just a fleeting moment, it was proof that justice wasn't only about punishment, but about building something lasting, something good. As he wove through the throng, shaking hands and exchanging smiles that crinkled the corners of his eyes, Jake spotted Mia near the dunk tank. She stood with a gaggle of kids, her auburn ponytail bouncing as she waved him over with uncontainable glee. "Jake," she shouted, her voice cutting through the noise like a bell, her face glowing with excitement. "You've got to get in the dunk tank again. Everyone's dying to take a shot at you." Jake threw his head back and laughed, raising his hands in exaggerated surrender. "Again, Mia. I've already been soaked 3 times today. I'm starting to think you all just like seeing me shiver." Her eyes sparkled with mischief as she grinned, unrelenting. "One more time. Come on, it's for charity." With a theatrical sigh that didn't quite hide his amusement, Jake relented. Truth be told, he didn't mind one bit. This being here, drenched, and ridiculous for the sake of a good cause was what it all boiled down to. It wasn't about the badge or the uniform anymore. It was about belonging to something greater, showing up for the people who'd given him a second chance. As he climbed onto the rickety seat above the tank, he caught Caroline's eye in the crowd. She stood a few feet away, arms crossed casually, her lips curved in a knowing smile. She flashed him a thumbs up, and Jake couldn't help but beam back, the connection between them unspoken but solid. "All right, Mia," he called out, settling into position with a playful smirk. "Let's see what you've got, kid." Mia stepped up to the line, her small frame radiating determination. She wound up her arm, her tongue poking out in concentration, and let the ball fly. It struck the target dead on, and with a resounding splash, Jake plunged into the icy water. The crowd erupted into cheers and laughter, a wave of joy washing over them as he clambered out. Dripping and grinning like a fool, water streamed down his face, plastering his hair to his forehead. But the chill couldn't touch the warmth blooming inside him. In that moment, something shifted, a quiet release. The guilt that had once gnawed at him, the shame of his old arrogance, the weight of every time he'd abused his power, they didn't vanish. But they no longer held him captive. He'd faced them head-on, owned them, and poured everything into making amends. And in return, he'd found a home not just as Officer Hardin, but as Jake, a neighbor, a friend, a man remade. As the sun dipped low, painting the streets in hues of gold and amber, the block party began to wind down. Vendors packed up their booths, folding tables with weary satisfaction. Kids lingered at the game stations, pleading for one last turn. While the music softened into a gentle farewell, Jake found himself at the edge of the park, gazing out over Alderwood, a town he'd grown to love in a way he hadn't thought possible. It wasn't flawless. It had its scars, its struggles, its quiet tensions. But it was a place where people looked out for each other, where forgiveness wasn't just a word, but a lived promise, where change wasn't a dream, but a slow, steady reality. A small hand slipped into his, startling him from his reverie. He glanced down to see Mia beside him, her wide hazel eyes reflecting the fading light. She looked up at him, her expression soft, but brimming with something like awe. "You did good today, Jake," she said, her voice hushed yet steady, carrying a weight beyond her years. His throat tightened, and he squeezed her hand gently, his heart swelling with a fullness he couldn't name. "So did you, kiddo," he replied, his voice rough with emotion. They stood there together, watching the last slivers of sunlight slip behind the horizon. The air cooled, the distant hum of laughter fading into a peaceful stillness. And for the first time in years, Jake felt truly at rest. In the months that followed, Jake's presence in Alderwood deepened. The community outreach program he'd championed blossomed into a cornerstone of the town, drawing in more officers eager to bridge the gap and residents ready to meet them halfway. Tom Landry became a fixture at youth sports days, his gruff exterior melting away as he coached kids with a fatherly pride. Maya Rodriguez turned her mural project into a weekly workshop, her quiet tenacity inspiring a rotating cast of teens to leave their mark on the town literally and figuratively. The bond between the police and the people grew stronger, the old divides softening like worn edges on a well-loved book. For Jake, though, it was never about the praise or the spotlight. It wasn't about being the savior who fixed it all. It was about showing up, day after day, for the people who needed him, about proving, through every small act, that he'd left his old self behind. One evening, after hours spent sorting donations at the food bank, Jake trudged home, exhaustion tugging at his bones. He fumbled with his mailbox, expecting bills or junk, but instead pulled out a single envelope, his name scrawled in a child's careful hand. His pulse quickened as he tore it open, unfolding a letter from Mia. "Dear Jake," it began, the words wobbly but deliberate. "Thank you for always being there for me and my mom. You've shown me what it really means to help people. I used to be scared of you, back when I didn't know you, but now I see you're one of the good ones. I want to be a police officer like you when I grow up, because I want to help people the way you do. Love, Mia." Jake stood there in the dim light of his porch, the letter trembling in his hands as tears blurred his vision. He'd come so far through the wreckage of his past, through the hard lessons of humility and accountability, and this simple note was the truest measure of it all. He folded it carefully, tucking it into his jacket pocket, close to his heart. The weight of his mistakes didn't crush him anymore. It guided him, a quiet reminder of how power, misused, could wound and how justice, pursued with care, could heal. He wasn't the man who'd once seen the world in stark absolutes. He'd learned to navigate its grays, to see people for their messy, beautiful truth, and to offer them what he'd once denied: respect, kindness, a chance to be heard. And in that, he'd uncovered the deepest lesson of all: that real justice wasn't about wielding authority, but about earning trust, one small, steady step at a time. On any other morning, the familiar rhythm of Grant Park would have unfolded like a well-worn melody. Neighbors strolling with their dogs would tip their heads in quiet greeting, and Raymond, perched on his usual bench, would respond with a smile that carried the warmth of decades spent in this very spot. The air would hum with the soft rustle of leaves, the distant bark of a dog, the murmur of early risers easing into their day. But this morning, as the first light of March 11th, 2025, crept over the horizon, something felt off, something intangible yet heavy, like a storm brewing just beyond sight. Raymond's fingers curled around his coffee cup, the steam curling upward in lazy spirals. But his usual peace eluded him. A tension hung in the air, sharp and unfamiliar, tugging at the edges of his awareness. The park stretched out before him, mostly deserted save for a handful of figures dotting the landscape: joggers with earbuds, an older woman feeding crumbs to the pigeons. Raymond took a slow sip, savoring the bitterness on his tongue, when movement at the park's entrance caught his eye. A man in uniform strode through the gate, his steps deliberate, his posture rigid. At first, Raymond dismissed it. Trenton was a small city, after all, and the local police were as much a part of the scenery as the oak trees lining the paths. But as the figure drew closer, Raymond realized this wasn't one of the familiar facetely grizzled veterans who'd nod hello or chat about the weather. This officer was young, his face carved with a sternness that seemed too severe for the quiet morning, his eyes sweeping the park with a purpose that felt misplaced. Officer David Clark was new to the force, fresh from the academy with a badge still shiny and untested. He carried himself with an authority that weighed more than his slight frame suggested, each step a declaration of control. He'd graduated with dreams of making a name for himself, of proving his worth in a world that demanded respecter, so he told himself as he scanned the park, his gaze locking onto Raymond. To Clark, the older man on the bench was just a silhouette at first, a solitary figure in a navy jacket hunched over a newspaper. But something about Raymond, perhaps the stillness, perhaps the way he seemed so rooted to the spot, pricked at Clark's instincts. He straightened his shoulders, adjusted his utility belt, and started toward the bench, his boots grinding against the gravel path with a sound that cut through the morning hush. Raymond felt the officer's stare before he heard the footsteps. His heart gave a quick, unsteady thud, though he couldn't say why. He wasn't breaking any laws, never had, not in the 60-odd years he'd called this neighborhood home. Yet that look in Clark's eyes stirred something deep, a memory of countless moments when he'd been made to feel out of place in spaces he'd fought to claim. He kept his gaze on the newspaper, the print blurring as his mind churned, hoping the officer would pass by without a word. But the crunch of gravel grew louder, closer, until it stopped just a few feet away. "Good morning," Clark said, his voice ringing out with a firmness that bordered on accusation. It wasn't a greeting so much as a challenge, the words clipped and edged with suspicion. Raymond glanced up, forcing a polite smile despite the unease coiling in his chest. "Morning," he replied, his tone light but guarded. Clark stood there, hands resting on his belt, his face a mask of stone. He didn't smile back. "What are you doing here, sir?" he asked, the question slicing through the air like a blade, direct and unyielding. Raymond's brow furrowed, confusion flickering across his weathered features. "Just enjoying my coffee," he said, lifting the cup slightly as if to prove his point. "I've been coming to this park for years." The officer's eyes narrowed, his lips pressing into a thin line, as though Raymond's words were a puzzle he didn't trust. "Do you live around here?" Clark pressed, his voice growing sharper, more insistent. Raymond nodded, the smile fading as a flicker of irritation sparked within him. "A few blocks away. Been there over 30 years. This is my neighborhood." For a moment, Clark said nothing. His gaze roamed over Raymond, scrutinizing every detailed creases in his jacket, the gray stubble on his chin, the way his hands rested calmly on his lap. It was as if he were searching for a crack, a hint of guilt to justify the suspicion simmering in his chest. Then, with a voice cold as the morning dew, he spoke again. "Do you have any ID on you?" The question hit Raymond like a gust of wind, unexpected and jarring. He blinked, his steady heartbeat faltering for a fraction of a second. ID in the park. He'd walked these paths longer than this kid had been alive, and never once had anyone demanded proof of his existence here. "ID," Raymond echoed, his tone even but laced with disbelief. He met Clark's gaze, searching the younger man's face for some sign of reason. Clark's expression remained unreadable, but his stance shifted as weight leaning forward, his fingers twitching near the holster at his hip. "I'm not sure why I'd need that," Raymond continued, his voice steady despite the rising tide of frustration. "I'm just sitting here, minding my own business." Clark's jaw tightened, his patience thinning. "I need to verify that you belong in this neighborhood," he said, his tone hardening into something almost mechanical. "We've had some issues lately." The words landed like a slap, and Raymond felt his chest tighten with an old, familiar ache. Issues. He knew what that meant, knew it in his bones, in the marrow of a life shaped by segregation, by decades of being watched, questioned, pushed aside. Here it was again, in 2024, in the park he'd helped preserve through years of community cleanups and quiet mornings like this. 1. His jaw clenched, the frustration bubbling up from a well he'd thought long dry. But Raymond wasn't the firebrand he'd been in his youth. The fight that once blazed in him had dulled to embers, replaced by a weariness that settled into his joints like the ache of winter. "Officer," he said slowly, his voice a calm anchor against the storm brewing inside. "I've been sitting on this bench long before you were born. I don't think I need to prove anything." Clark flinched, just for a moment, as if the words had struck a nerve, but then his expression hardened, his hand settling more firmly on his holster. "Sir," he said, his voice dropping to a low, commanding growl, "I'm going to need you to show me some identification. Now." The air between them thickened, charged with a tension that seemed to ripple outward. A few passers by, a jogger in a bright red hoodie, an older couple with a terrier slowed their pace, their eyes darting toward the scene with growing unease. Whispers floated on the breeze, but no one dared step closer. Raymond's fingers brushed the cane leaning against the bench, its worn handle cool against his skin. He gripped it, using it to pull himself to his feet, the years pressing down on his legs with every movement. He wasn't in the mood for a fight, not anymore, but he wouldn't let this officer trample over him either. "I'm not causing any trouble," he said quietly, locking eyes with Clark. "But I'm not about to let you treat me like a criminal for sitting in a park." Clark's face flushed, his authority slipping through his fingers like sand. He was young, untested, and the defiance in Raymond's voice gnawed at him. His control, his power was being challenged, and he felt it eroding with every word. He took a step closer, his boots scuffing the gravel, when a new figure emerged from the shadows of the tall hedges lining the path. Kelvin Williams had been watching from a bench beneath a sprawling oak, its branches casting dappled shade over his broad shoulders. A retired schoolteacher in his early 60s, Kelvin carried himself with the quiet dignity of someone who'd spent decades wrangling classrooms and calming storms. His graying hair caught the light as he rose, his eyes narrowing at the sight unfolding before him. He'd come to Grant Park for the same reason as Raymonto finds solace in the rustle of leaves and the chirping of sparrows, to escape the clamor of a world that never seemed to slow down. When Clark first entered the park, Kelvin had barely registered him. assuming he was just another officer on patrol. But as the confrontation escalated, as Clark's voice grew sharper, and his hand hovered too close to his weapon, Kelvin's stomach twisted with a cold dread. He'd seen this before too many times, and he knew how quickly it could spiral. He moved toward them with a swiftness that belied his age, his footsteps soft but purposeful on the gravel. Raymond caught sight of him first, a flicker of relief softening the tension in his face. Though his body remained coiled, Clark, too focused on Raymond, didn't notice the newcomer until Kelvin's voice sliced through the standoff. "Is there a problem here, officer?" he asked, his tone steady but weighted with the authority of experience. He'd faced down principals, parents, and even the occasional unruly cop in his time, and he knew how to keep his composure when the air crackled with conflict. Clark's head snapped toward Kelvin, surprise flashing across his face before morphing into annoyance. "This is none of your concern, sir," he barked, his frustration spilling over. "Please step back." But Kelvin didn't budge. Instead, he edged closer, positioning himself just slightly nearer to Raymond, his hands loose and open at his sides, entreating, but resolute. "It's my concern now," he said calmly, his voice a soothing balm against Clark's rising agitation. "I've been sitting over there for a while, and I couldn't help but overhear." Clark's grip on his holster tightened, his knuckles whitening. "And what exactly did you hear?" he demanded, his tone laced with a challenge. Kelvin glanced at Raymond, then back at the officer, his gaze unflinching. "I heard an elderly man, a longtime resident of this neighborhood, being harassed for sitting in a public park. That's what I heard." The words hung in the air, heavy with truth, and Clark's face darkened with a mix of anger and embarrassment. He was losing ground, his authority unraveling before an audience he hadn't anticipated. To him, this was a chance to assert his power, to prove he belonged in this uniform. But to Raymond, it was a bitter echo of a past he'd fought to leave behind, a reminder that justice could still bend under the weight of unchecked power. And to Kelvin, it was a call to action, a moment to stand against the kind of overreach that left scars on communities like theirs. Raymond straightened, his cane tapping the ground as he shifted his weight. "I have every right to be here," he said, his voice steady as steel. "I don't have to go anywhere." Clark's eyes darted between the two men, his breath quickening. He stepped toward Kelvin, closing the gap, his voice dropping to a growl. "You need to watch your tone. This is official business." Kelvin met his glare without flinching, his calm demeanor a stark contrast to Clark's fraying composure. "I'm not here to argue," he said, his words measured, "but I'm also not here to watch someone be treated unjustly for no reason." The standoff stretched taut, a fragile thread ready to snap. The lesson was clear: power, when wielded without care, could unravel into chaos, leaving behind a trail of resentment and resistance. And in that quiet park, under the watchful eyes of a community too often pushed to its limits, the consequences of Clark's actions loomed larger than he could yet comprehend. In the sprawling expanse of Grant Park, beneath the heavy boughs of ancient oaks swaying lazily in the late morning breeze, Kelvin stood firm, his voice cutting through the stillness like a blade. "Watching anything except you," he shot back, his tone sharp but steady. His dark eyes locked on Officer Clark with an intensity that could have melted steel. His words weren't just defiance, they carried the weight of a man who'd grown tired of being questioned for simply existing. Beside him, Raymond, an older man with silver threading through his once dark hair, sat quietly on a weathered wooden bench, his hands resting atop a cane polished smooth by years of use. He'd said nothing during the initial exchange, his silence a shield, but now he lifted his gaze, his voice soft yet resonant. "Kelvin," he murmured, a gentle plea woven into the syllables, "it's all right. I don't want any trouble." His eyes, deep set and shadowed by time, flickered with a quiet weariness, as though he'd seen this scene play out too many times before. Kelvin turned his head slightly, catching Raymond's look, and for a fleeting moment, the hard lines of his face softened. A flicker of warmth passed between them, an unspoken bond forged through years of shared mornings. "In this very park, this isn't trouble, Rye," he replied, his voice lowering but firm with conviction. "It's about standing up for what's right." He straightened again, squaring his shoulders as if bracing for a storm, his broad frame casting a shadow across the cracked pavement. The air around them buzzed with tension, thick and electric, as Officer Clark, a weary man in his early 30s with a buzz cut and a uniform still stiff with newness, took another deliberate step forward. Now he stood mere inches from Kelvin, close enough that the younger man could smell the faint tang of coffee on his breath. Clark's eyes blazed with a frustration he couldn't quite mask, his jaw clenched tight. "You want trouble," he hissed, his voice low and venomous, a coiled snake ready to strike. "Because I can make this very difficult for you both." The moment teetered on the edge of chaos, a fragile thread stretched taut, ready to snap. Kelvin's fists tightened at his sides, his knuckles whitening, while Raymond's grip on his cane grew firmer, his arthritic fingers trembling slightly in it from fear, but from the slow simmer of anger he rarely let surface. Just as the confrontation seemed destined to erupt, a voice boomed across the park, deep and commanding, slicing through the tension like a gunshot echoing off the trees. "That's enough." The words reverberated, sharp and final, and all three men froze, their heads whipping toward the sound. Striding toward them with purposeful steps was Captain James Matthews, a towering figure in his late 40s whose presence seemed to fill the space around him. His uniform was crisp, the silver bars on his shoulders glinting faintly in the sunlight filtering through the leaves, but it was his demeanor steady, unyielding that truly demanded attention. Matthews had been driving past on his routine patrol when he'd caught sight of the brewing altercation from the street. Without hesitation, he'd pulled over, his long legs carrying him swiftly across the grassy expanse, his boots crunching against the gravel path. As he closed the distance, his sharp gray eyes assessed the scene. Kelvin, defiant and unbowed. Raymond, quiet but resolute, and Clark, bristling with misplaced authority. "Clark," Matthews barked, his voice a whip crack of authority as he came to a halt just steps away. "Stand down." Officer Clark's face drained of color, his bravado crumbling like dry clay. His hand, which had been hovering near his holster, fell limply to his side. He took a hasty step back, his boots scuffing the ground. "Captain," he stammered, but Matthews cut him off, his tone brooking no dissent. "I said stand down." The repetition was icy, leaving no room for negotiation, and Clark retreated another step, his posture stiffening into something almost mechanical. A soldier caught out of line. Matthews turned his attention to Raymond and Kelvin, his expression softening just enough to reveal the man beneath the badge. "Gentlemen," he said, his voice dipping into a respectful cadence, "is everything all right here?" Kelvin kept his eyes on Clark for a beat longer, as if ensuring the threat had truly receded, before nodding slowly. "I think we're all right now, Captain," he replied, his words measured but edged with lingering caution. "But your officer here seemed a little too eager to throw his weight around." Matthews' gaze shifted to Clark, his eyes narrowing into slits of disapproval. "Clark," he said, his voice dropping dangerously low, "what exactly do you think you're doing?" Clark faltered, his earlier confidence dissolving into a nervous stammer. "I was just checking to see if he belonged here, sir. We've had complaints." His eyes darted between Matthews and the two men, seeking an escape that wasn't there. Matthews' brow furrowed, his lips pressing into a thin line. "You had complaints," he interrupted, his tone dripping with skepticism, "about an elderly man sitting quietly in a park, minding his own business?" Clark swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing visibly, his hands twitching at his sides. "You didn't know who he was," he managed, but the excuse sounded feeble even to his own ears. "You didn't need to," Matthews snapped, his voice rising with a controlled fury. "This is a public park. You don't harass people for sitting in public spaces." His words landed like hammer blows, each one driving home the lesson Clark had so carelessly ignored. Raymond, who had held his silence through most of the exchange, finally spoke again, his voice steady, but laced with a quiet frustration that cut deeper than any shout. "I've been coming to this park for 30 years, Captain," he said, his eyes locking onto Clark's with an intensity that made the younger man flinch. "Never had a problem until today." The statement hung in the air, heavy with the weight of decades, a testament to a man who'd carved out a small sanctuary here only to have it violated by reckless arrogance. Matthews nodded, his jaw tight with a frustration that mirrored Raymond's own. "And you shouldn't have had one today," he said firmly. "This is not how we do things." He turned back to Clark, his voice hardening into something unyielding. "Go back to the station. I'll deal with you later." Clark hesitated, his mouth opening as if to protest. But the look in Matthew's eyes a storm of resilience him. With a stiff nod, he turned and walked away, his boots dragging across the gravel, each step a reluctant retreat. The sound faded into the distance, and with it, the suffocating tension began to dissipate, though a faint unease lingered like smoke after a fire. Matthews exhaled deeply, running a hand through his close-cropped hair, the gesture betraying a weariness he rarely let show. He turned back to Raymond and Kelvin, his expression softening once more. "I apologize for that," he said quietly, sincerity threading through his words. "That was unacceptable. I'll make sure it doesn't happen again." Raymond studied him for a long moment, his weathered face unreadable, then offered a small nod. "I appreciate that, Captain," he said, his tone even but tinged with doubt. "But this isn't the first time something like this has happened, and I doubt it'll be the last." Matthews sighed, the weight of his position pressing down on him like a physical burden. "I know," he admitted, his voice heavy with the truth. "But I'm working on it. We're trying to change things." Kelvin, who'd been silent since Clark's departure, stepped forward, his broad shoulders squared with purpose. "It's going to take more than just trying, Captain," he said, his voice steady but firm. "A challenge wrapped in respect. It's going to take action. Real change." Matthews met his gaze, and for a moment, Kelvin saw beyond the uniform, saw the fatigue etched into the lines of the captain's face, but also a spark of determination that refused to dim. "You're right," Matthews replied, nodding slowly, "and I promise you, things will change. I'll make sure of it." Raymond, his body still taut with the morning's strain, let his gaze drift across the park, taking in the familiar sweep of green lawns and the distant chatter of birds. "I hope so," he said softly, almost to himself, his voice carrying the faint tremor of a man who'd hoped before and been disappointed. "I really hope so." The air in Grant Park settled into an uneasy stillness, the confrontation's echoes fading but not forgotten. Matthews watched Clark's retreating figure disappear beyond the tree line, his chest rising and falling with a deep breath. He wasn't new to this. Decades on the force had shown him the fault lines running through his community, the mistrust that festered when power was wielded without care. "Raymond," he said, using the older man's first name now, a quiet gesture of familiarity. "I know this can't undo what just happened, but I want you to know we're not all like that." Clark's new. He's still learning. The words felt thin even as they left his mouth, a bandage too small for the wound. Raymond didn't respond immediately. His eyes roamed the park, lingering on the bench where he'd sat every morning for years, a place that had once been his refuge. Today, that peace had been shattered, and his hands tightened around his cane, the wood creaking faintly under his grip. "It's always something," he muttered, more to the wind than to Matthews, his voice rough with the weight of memory. "Always something." Kelvin, standing close by, gave a tight nod, his own emotions churning beneath his calm exterior. "It's not just about learning, Captain," he said, his tone measured but piercing. "It's about understanding." Clark didn't just came in here already thinking he knew what to expect from us. That's the problem. Matthews shifted his weight, discomfort flickering across his face. He knew Kelvin spoke the truth he'd grappled with since the day he'd pinned on his badge. The department carried a legacy, a culture older than he was, one that bred assumptions and eroded trust. Changing it wouldn't be simple. But Matthews wasn't a man to shy from a fight. "I'm not going to make excuses for him," he said, his voice firming with resolve. "He'll face consequences for this, I assure you. And more than that, we'll be implementing new training not just for Clark, but for everyone." Raymond turned to face him, his expression unreadable for a moment before a quiet, bitter chuckle escaped his lips. "Training, huh?" he said, the words sharp with skepticism. "You think training's going to change what's in his heart?" The question hung between them, heavy and unanswered. Matthews didn't reply immediately. He'd heard it before, from voices worn thin by promises that never materialized. He wanted to believe training could help, that it could chip away at the prejudice Clark had worn like armor, but doubt not at him. "It's a start," he said finally, though the words felt fragile. A whisper against the storm of reality. Raymond sighed, the sound deep and resonant, carrying the exhaustion of a man who'd seen too many starts fade into nothing. His shoulders, once broad and strong, slumped slightly under the burden of it all. He looked up at Matthews, his eyes glinting with a weariness born of decades of small injustices piling up like stones. "I've seen starts before, Captain," he said softly, his voice barely above a murmur. "I've seen them come and go. What I haven't seen is a finish." Kelvin watched the exchange, his heart heavy with the weight of their shared reality. He'd known Matthews for years, respected him even before he'd climbed the ranks. But respect didn't blind him to the cracks that still marred the system. He placed a hand on Raymond's shoulder, a silent anchor, then turned to Matthews. "I'm going to hold you to that, Captain," he said, his voice steady but unyielding. "Because this can't keep happening." Matthews met his gaze, and for the first time, Kelvin glimpsed the man behind the title, not just the fatigue, but a fire that refused to gutter out. "You have my word," Matthews replied, his tone resolute. "I'm not just saying this to smooth things over. We need real change, and I'll make sure of it." Raymond, feeling the morning's toll settle into his bones, gestured toward the bench. "I think I'm going to sit for a minute," he said, his voice quiet but firm. He moved slowly, his cane tapping a soft rhythm against the pavement as he eased himself back onto the seat, where it had all begun. He took a deep breath, the air cool against his skin, and let his eyes drift across the park once more. The lesson here wasn't lost on him. Justice wasn't just about words or promises. It was about action, about consequences that held weight. And as the wind rustled the leaves above, he couldn't help but wonder if this time, at last, the finish might finally come. In the sprawling expanse of Grant Park, beneath the heavy boughs of ancient oaks swaying lazily in the late morning breeze, Kelvin stood firm, his voice cutting through the stillness like a blade. "Watching anything except you," he shot back, his tone sharp but steady. His dark eyes locked on Officer Clark with an intensity that could have melted steel. His words weren't just defiance, they carried the weight of a man who'd grown tired of being questioned for simply existing. Beside him, Raymond, an older man with silver threading through his once dark hair, sat quietly on a weathered wooden bench, his hands resting atop a cane polished smooth by years of use. He'd said nothing during the initial exchange, his silence a shield, but now he lifted his gaze, his voice soft yet resonant. "Kelvin," he murmured, a gentle plea woven into the syllables. "It's all right. I don't want any trouble." His eyes, deep set and shadowed by time, flickered with a quiet weariness, as though he'd seen this scene play out too many times before. Kelvin turned his head slightly, catching Raymond's look, and for a fleeting moment, the hard lines of his face softened. A flicker of warmth passed between them, an unspoken bond forged through years of shared mornings. "In this very park, this isn't trouble, Rye," he replied, his voice lowering but firm with conviction. "It's about standing up for what's right." He straightened again, squaring his shoulders as if bracing for a storm, his broad frame casting a shadow across the cracked pavement. The air around them buzzed with tension, thick and electric, as Officer Clark, a weary man in his early 30s with a buzz cut and a uniform still stiff with newness, took another deliberate step forward. Now he stood mere inches from Kelvin, close enough that the younger man could smell the faint tang of coffee on his breath. Clark's eyes blazed with a frustration he couldn't quite mask, his jaw clenched tight. "You want trouble," he hissed, his voice low and venomous, a coiled snake ready to strike. "Because I can make this very difficult for you both." The moment teetered on the edge of chaos, a fragile thread stretched taut, ready to snap. Kelvin's fists tightened at his sides, his knuckles whitening, while Raymond's grip on his cane grew firmer, his arthritic fingers trembling slightly not from fear, but from the slow simmer of anger he rarely let surface. Just as the confrontation seemed destined to erupt, a voice boomed across the park, deep and commanding, slicing through the tension like a gunshot echoing off the trees. "That's enough." The words reverberated, sharp and final, and all three men froze, their heads whipping toward the sound. Striding toward them with purposeful steps was Captain James Matthews, a towering figure in his late 40s whose presence seemed to fill the space around him. His uniform was crisp, the silver bars on his shoulders glinting faintly in the sunlight filtering through the leaves, but it was his demeanor steady, unyielding that truly demanded attention. Matthews had been driving past on his routine patrol when he'd caught sight of the brewing altercation from the street. Without hesitation, he'd pulled over, his long legs carrying him swiftly across the grassy expanse, his boots crunching against the gravel path. As he closed the distance, his sharp gray eyes assessed the scene. Kelvin, defiant and unbowed. Raymond, quiet but resolute, and Clark, bristling with misplaced authority. "Clark," Matthews barked, his voice a whip-crack of authority as he came to a halt just steps away. "Stand down." Officer Clark's face drained of color, his bravado crumbling like dry clay. His hand, which had been hovering near his holster, fell limply to his side. He took a hasty step back, his boots scuffing the ground. "Captain," he stammered, but Matthews cut him off, his tone brooking no dissent. "I said stand down." The repetition was icy, leaving no room for negotiation, and Clark retreated another step, his posture stiffening into something almost mechanical. A soldier caught out of line. Matthews turned his attention to Raymond and Kelvin, his expression softening just enough to reveal the man beneath the badge. "Gentlemen," he said, his voice dipping into a respectful cadence, "is everything all right here?" Kelvin kept his eyes on Clark for a beat longer, as if ensuring the threat had truly receded. Before nodding slowly, "I think we're all right now, Captain," he replied, his words measured but edged with lingering caution. "But your officer here seemed a little too eager to throw his weight around." Matthews' gaze shifted to Clark, his eyes narrowing into slits of disapproval. "Clark," he said, his voice dropping dangerously low, "what exactly do you think you're doing?" Clark faltered, his earlier confidence dissolving into a nervous stammer. "Was just checking to see if he belonged here, sir. We've had complaints." His eyes darted between Matthews and the two men, seeking an escape that wasn't there. Matthews' brow furrowed, his lips pressing into a thin line. "You had complaints," he interrupted, his tone dripping with skepticism, "about an elderly man sitting quietly in a park, minding his own business?" Clark swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing visibly, his hands twitching at his sides. "Didn't know who he was," he managed, but the excuse sounded feeble even to his own ears. "You didn't need to," Matthews snapped, his voice rising with a controlled fury. "This is a public park. You don't harass people for sitting in public spaces." His words landed like hammer blows, each one driving home the lesson Clark had so carelessly ignored. Raymond, who had held his silence through most of the exchange, finally spoke again, his voice steady, but laced with a quiet frustration that cut deeper than any shout. "I've been coming to this park for 30 years, Captain," he said, his eyes locking onto Clark's with an intensity that made the younger man flinch. "Never had a problem until today." The statement hung in the air, heavy with the weight of decades, a testament to a man who'd carved out a small sanctuary here only to have it violated by reckless arrogance. Matthews nodded, his jaw tight with a frustration that mirrored Raymond's own. "And you shouldn't have had one today," he said firmly. "This is not how we do things." He turned back to Clark, his voice hardening into something unyielding. "Go back to the station. I'll deal with you later." Clark hesitated, his mouth opening as if to protest, but the look in Matthews' eyes a storm of resolution him. With a stiff nod, he turned and walked away, his boots dragging across the gravel, each step a reluctant retreat. The sound faded into the distance, and with it, the suffocating tension began to dissipate, though a faint unease lingered like smoke after a fire. Matthews exhaled deeply, running a hand through his close-cropped hair, the gesture betraying a weariness he rarely let show. He turned back to Raymond and Kelvin, his expression softening once more. "I apologize for that," he said quietly, sincerity threading through his words. "That was unacceptable. I'll make sure it doesn't happen again." Raymond studied him for a long moment, his weathered face unreadable, then offered a small nod. "I appreciate that, Captain," he said, his tone even but tinged with doubt. But this isn't the first time something like this has happened, and I doubt it'll be the last. Matthews sighed, the weight of his position pressing down on him like a physical burden. I know, he admitted, his voice heavy with the truth. But I'm working on it. We're trying to change things. Kelvin, who'd been silent since Clark's departure, stepped forward, his broad shoulders squared with purpose. It's going to take more than just trying, Captain, he said, his voice steady but firm. A challenge wrapped in respect. It's going to take action. Real change. Matthews met his gaze, and for a moment, Kelvin saw beyond the uniform, saw the fatigue etched into the lines of the captain's face, but also a spark of determination that refused to dim. You're right, Matthews replied, nodding slowly, and I promise you, things will change. I'll make sure of it. Raymond, his body still taut with the morning's strain, let his gaze drift across the park, taking in the familiar sweep of green lawns and the distant chatter of birds. I hope so, he said softly, almost to himself, his voice carrying the faint tremor of a man who'd hoped before and been disappointed. I really hope so. The air in Grant Park settled into an uneasy stillness, the confrontation's echoes fading but not forgotten. Matthews watched Clark's retreating figure disappear beyond the tree line, his chest rising and falling with a deep breath. He wasn't new to fisticades on the force had shown him the fault lines running through his community, the mistrust that festered when power was wielded without care. Raymond, he said, using the older man's first name now, a quiet gesture of familiarity. I know this can't undo what just happened, but I want you to know we're not all like that. Clark's new. He's still learning. The words felt thin even as they left his mouth. A bandage too small for the wound. Raymond didn't respond immediately. His eyes roamed the park, lingering on the bench where he'd sat every morning for years, a place that had once been his refuge. Today, that peace had been shattered, and his hands tightened around his cane, the wood creaking faintly under his grip. It's always something, he muttered, more to the wind than to Matthews, his voice rough with the weight of memory. Always something. Kelvin, standing close by, gave a tight nod, his own emotions churning beneath his calm exterior. It's not just about learning, Captain, he said, his tone measured but piercing. It's about understanding. Clark didn't just came in here already thinking he knew what to expect from us. That's the problem. Matthews shifted his weight, discomfort flickering across his face. He knew Kelvin spoke the truth he'd grappled with since the day he'd pinned on his badge. The department carried a legacy, a culture older than he was, one that bred assumptions and eroded trust. Changing it wouldn't be simple. But Matthews wasn't a man to shy from a fight. I'm not going to make excuses for him, he said, his voice firming with resolve. He'll face consequences for this, I assure you. And more than that, we'll be implementing new training not just for Clark, but for everyone. Raymond turned to face him, his expression unreadable for a moment before a quiet, bitter chuckle escaped his lips. Training, huh, he said, the words sharp with skepticism. You think training's going to change what's in his heart? The question hung between them, heavy and unanswered. Matthews didn't reply immediately. He'd heard it before, from voices worn thin by promises that never materialized. He wanted to believe training could help, that it could chip away at the prejudice Clark had worn like armor, but doubt gnawed at him. It's a start, he said finally, though the words felt fragile, a whisper against the storm of reality. Raymond sighed, the sound deep and resonant, carrying the exhaustion of a man who'd seen too many starts fade into nothing. His shoulders, once broad and strong, slumped slightly under the burden of it all. He looked up at Matthews, his eyes glinting with a weariness born of decades of small injustices piling up like stones. I've seen starts before, Captain, he said softly, his voice barely above a murmur. I've seen them come and go. What I haven't seen is a finish. Kelvin watched the exchange, his heart heavy with the weight of their shared reality. He'd known Matthews for years, respected him even before he'd climbed the ranks. But respect didn't blind him to the cracks that still marred the system. He placed a hand on Raymond's shoulder, a silent anchor, then turned to Matthews. I'm going to hold you to that, Captain, he said, his voice steady but unyielding. Because this can't keep happening. Matthews met his gaze, and for the first time, Kelvin glimpsed the man behind the title, not just the fatigue, but a fire that refused to gutter out. "You have my word," Matthews replied, his tone resolute. "I'm not just saying this to smooth things over. We need real change, and I'll make sure of it." Raymond, feeling the morning's toll settle into his bones, gestured toward the bench. "I think I'm going to sit for a minute," he said, his voice quiet but firm. He moved slowly, his cane tapping a soft rhythm against the pavement as he eased himself back onto the seat, where it had all begun. He took a deep breath, the air cool against his skin, and let his eyes drift across the park once more. The lesson here wasn't lost on him. Justice wasn't just about words or promises. It was about action, about consequences that held weight. And as the wind rustled the leaves above, he couldn't help but wonder if this time, at last, the finish might finally come. The air in Grant Park was heavy with unspoken stories as the crowd stood together, their faces etched with a quiet understanding born from years of shared struggles. Among them, Raymond felt the weight of countless gazes, each one reflecting a flicker of their own battles against a world that too often judged them unworthy. Not long ago, a young officer had spotted him sitting on a weathered bench beneath the sprawling oaks, his dark skin somehow an affront to the orderly scene of the park. That officer, barely old enough to understand the history he was stepping into, had approached with a stiff gait and a voice clipped with authority, demanding to know why Raymond was there. Why? Because he dared to exist in a public space, a black man resting in the late afternoon sun. The absurdity of it churned in Raymond's gut, a bitter taste he'd swallowed too many times before. He shook his head now, the motion slow and deliberate, as a surge of anger broke through the calm he usually wore like armor. His deep brown eyes flashed with a fire that had smoldered since the 1960s, when he'd marched through streets thick with tear gas and defiance. "I've seen this play out over and over," he said, his voice low but trembling with the force of memory. "Back then, we thought we were bending the arc toward justice, but here we are decades later, and it's the same damn script." The crowd around him stirred, a murmur of agreement rippling through them like a stone dropped into still water. They weren't just listening, they were feeling it, their own frustrations bubbling up to meet his words. This wasn't just about Raymond anymore. It was about every soul gathered in that park, every life tangled in a system that seemed designed to keep them small. Beside him, Kelvin stood as a steady pillar, his broad shoulders squared against the tension in the air. He didn't need to say much, his presence alone spoke volumes, a silent promise that Raymond wouldn't carry this burden alone. For a moment, Raymond paused, his chest rising and falling as he gathered the scattered threads of his thoughts. The park stretched out around them, its grassy expanse dotted with old trees that had witnessed generations come and go. A faint breeze rustled the leaves, carrying the distant hum of the city beyond, a city that had turned a blind eye to their pain for far too long. "We're tired," Raymond said at last, his voice growing stronger, cutting through the murmurs like a blade. "Every time this happens, it chips away at you, steals a piece of our peace, our hope, but it also sparks something fierce inside. We've endured too much to let this fade into silence. If we don't stand up now, who's next? Who's after that?" The energy in the crowd shifted, a slow burn igniting into something electric. What had started as a hushed gathering beneath the park's ancient canopy was swelling into a force, a wave of resolve crashing against years of exhaustion. Kelvin stepped closer to the center, his boots scuffing against the packed earth as he turned to face the sea of faces. "We all know what's at stake," he said, his voice deep and unwavering, resonating with the kind of certainty that could anchor a storm. "We can't sit back and hope the system fixes itself. It's never going to. Change starts here with us, today. If we want justice, we've got to demand it, loud and clear." His words hung in the air, heavy with purpose, and the crowd responded, their restlessness sharpening into focus. From the throng, a young woman emerged, her steps purposeful as she wove through the press of bodies. Her name was Aisha, though few knew it. Yesh was just another face in the crowd until that moment. Her braids swung gently against her shoulders, and her eyes burned with a fury tempered by resolve. "We've talked enough," she said, her voice steady, but laced with a raw edge that made heads turn. "How do we make them hear us, really hear us?" The question lingered, sharp and urgent. And Raymond caught Kelvin's eye. They both knew the road ahead wouldn't be smooth marches, petitions, endless debates with stone-faced officials. They'd tried it all before. But they also knew the cost of doing nothing, the way silence invited more boots on their necks. "We show up," Kelvin replied, his tone firm as granite. "We make them see use every single one of us. We demand accountability, respect, a system that doesn't treat us like threats just for breathing." The crowd buzzed now, a hive of voices weaving plans into the air. Some spoke of a rally, others of storming City Hall with questions that wouldn't be ignored. Among them were seasoned organizers, people like Marla, a weary woman with gray streaks in her hair and a clipboard perpetually tucked under her arm. She'd been at this since the 80s, her sharp tongue and sharper mind a force to be reckoned with. Then there were the newcomers, like Jamal, a lanky teenager whose hands shook with nervous energy as he scribbled ideas on a crumpled napkin. Their passion was raw, unpolished, born from a lifetime of watching the system fail them. As the voices grew louder, Raymond felt a spark flicker in his chest, a fragile hope he hadn't dared to nurture in years. He was weary, his bones aching with the weight of decades, but the sight of Aisha, Jamal, and so many others stepping forward lit something new within him. Maybe this time, the fire wouldn't gutter out. Kelvin's hand landed on Raymond's shoulder, warm and solid, as if he could feel the shift in his friend's heart. "We're not alone in this, Ray," he said softly, his voice cutting through the rising clamor. "Look at them, they're ready." Raymond turned his gaze to the crowd, and for the first time in a long while, a small, real smile tugged at his lips. "I know," he murmured, "it's time." The next few days blurred into a whirlwind of motion and purpose. Word of the confrontation spread like wildfire, racing through social media threads and crackling across local news stations. In the city of Trenton, the story took root, sprouting outrage not just over Raymond's encounter, but over the deeper rot. It exposed years of racial profiling, of harassment swept under the rug. Kelvin threw himself into the fight, rallying a tight-knit crew of organizers who worked late into the night. They met in cramped living rooms and dimly lit church basements, drafting emails, plotting routes, and pleading with local leaders for support. The rally they envisioned wouldn't just be about Raymond, it would be a reckoning for every wound the community had borne in silence. Raymond, though, wasn't sure he wanted to be the face of it all. He'd never craved attention, even back when he was young and fearless, chanting in the streets with a megaphone in hand. Now, leaning on his cane, he felt the years pressing down on him, whispering doubts into his mind. What if he wasn't enough? What if his voice faltered? But Kelvin wouldn't hear it. "This is bigger than you, man," he'd said one night. His eyes locked on Raymond's over a chipped coffee mug. "Your story, it's the match that lit this fire. We need you." Deep down, Raymond knew he was right. If his humiliation in that park could peel back the city's polite veneer and expose the injustice festering beneath, then he'd bear the spotlight. Discomfort be damned. When the day of the rally dawned, Grant Park transformed. Gone was the quiet refuge of scattered benches and whispering trees. Now it brimmed with hundreds of voices, a chorus of defiance rising into the crisp March air. Signs bobbed above the crowd, bold letters proclaiming justice for all, we belong. And no more silence. The ground thrummed with footsteps, the atmosphere thick with a determination that felt almost tangible. Raymond stood near the front, his cane sinking slightly into the soft earth as he took it all in. The faces around him, young and old, black and white, stirred memories of those long-ago marches, a bittersweet echo of a fight that refused to end. Kelvin was beside him, coordinating with Marla and a few others as they prepared to speak. "This is bigger than us now," he said, turning to Raymond with a look that held both pride and weight. "This is the whole city, the whole damn country." Raymond nodded, still grappling with the scale of it. He'd never dreamed his quiet moment in the park could ripple out this far, touching lives he'd never even met. Aisha stepped to the microphone first, her voice slicing through the chatter like a beacon. She spoke of unity, of tearing down a system that chewed up people of color and spat them out. "We're here for Raymond," she said, "but we're here for all of us, for every name we've lost, every story we've buried." When it was Raymond's turn, the crowd hushed, a sea of eyes fixing on him as he shuffled forward. His cane tapped a steady rhythm against the makeshift stage. each step a quiet testament to his resolve. He stopped, gazing out at the faces stretching before him, some weary, some fierce, all waiting. "I've been here before," he began, his voice carrying over the park like a river finding its course. "I've stood in front of crowds just like you, fighting for the same things we're chasing today. And I'll tell you the truth, it wears you down." A ripple of recognition passed through the listeners, heads nodding as they felt the exhaustion he described. "But we can't stop," he pressed on, his tone hardening. "We can't let that tiredness shut us up. Because if we do, nothing changes. And I'm done waiting for a change that's always just out of reach." He swept his gaze across them, his heart pounding as decades of frustration poured out. "This isn't about me, it's about us, our kids, our grandkids. It's about making damn sure they don't inherit the same fight. We deserve better respect, dignity, a world that doesn't punish us for the color of our skin. And if we don't demand it, who will? So I'm begging you, don't let this fade. Don't let this be just another day we talk and go home. Let this be the start of something real." The applause roared up, a thunderous wave that lifted the heaviness from his shoulders, if only for a moment. He wasn't finished it yet. As the rally wound down, the organizers huddled, plotting next steps with a fervor that refused to dim. Kelvin, Raymond, and their core group set their sights on City Hall, determined to push for reform, spitter police training, real community oversight, consequences that stuck. From the crowd's edge, Captain Matthews watched, his face a mask of quiet intensity. He'd come not just to observe but to listen, the sting of Officer Clark's actions still fresh in his mind. His department had failed again, and he knew it. When the throng began to thin, he approached Raymond and Kelvin, his strides purposeful. "That was powerful," he said, his voice steady but earnest. "I'm listening." Kelvin met his gaze, cautious but open. "That's a start, Captain. But we need more than ears, we need action." Matthews nodded, unflinching. "I know. I've already started pushing changes, training, accountability. It won't happen overnight. But we're in this." For Raymond, the words were a thread of possibility, fragile but real. Justice wasn't just a dream to chase, it was a lesson carved into their bones, a warning to those who wielded power without care. The consequences of that abuse had brought them here, to this park, to this moment, and they wouldn't let it slip away. Raymond Brooks stood still for a moment, his weathered eyes tracing every line on Captain Matthews' face, searching for something sincerity, perhaps, or just a flicker of the accountability he'd been chasing for years. The air between them hung heavy, thick with the weight of unspoken history. After a long, deliberate pause, he gave a slow nod, the kind that carried more resolve than agreement. "It's a long road ahead, Captain," he said, his voice low but steady. "And we're gonna hold you to every word you've said." Matthews, standing tall in his pressed uniform, extended his hand, the gesture tentative yet laden with intent. Raymond hesitated, his calloused fingers hovering in the space between them, as if weighing the worth of this fragile truce. Then, with a quiet breath, he clasped the captain's hand. It wasn't a grand reconciliation, triumphant music swelled in the background, but it was a start. A faint ripple in the stagnant waters of distrust that had pooled around them for far too long. In that fleeting grip, there was a silent promise. Justice might be slow, but it wouldn't be forgotten. The weeks that unfurled after that handshake were a whirlwind of activity, a stark contrast to the quiet despair that had once settled over Trenton, Tennessee. Raymond found himself swept up in a tide of meetings, some held under the dim lights of church basements, others in crowded community centers where folding chairs creaked under the weight of hope. Voices, once muted by fear or apathy, now rose in a chorus of determination. He spoke at local gatherings, his words deliberate and heavy with the wisdom of a man who'd seen too much, yet still believed in more. In private, he sat across from city officials, his gaze unyielding as he pressed for answers, for change that wasn't just whispered, but carved into reality. This wasn't the role he'd imagined for himself. Raymond had always thought his fighting days were behind him, left to the vigor of youth. Yet here he was, an unexpected beacon in a movement he hadn't sought, but couldn't turn away from. His every step a testament to the consequences of power misused and the slow, arduous climb toward fairness. Kelvin, his steadfast companion, was no less relentless. A man of action rather than words, he toiled alongside organizers, his hands stained with ink from drafting proposals, his mind sharp with strategies to reshape police policies. Together, they refused to settle for scraps of assurances or hollow platitudes wouldn't do. They demanded accountability that could be measured, reform that could be felt. One crisp afternoon, the two men found themselves back at Grant Park, perched on the same weathered bench where their journey had sparked. The air was cool, the leaves overhead rustling in a gentle breeze as the sun dipped low, painting the sky in hues of amber and gold. Raymond's eyes swept across the park, taking in the children chasing each other near the swings, the elderly couple strolling arm in arm. "We've still got miles to go," he murmured, his voice soft but threaded with a newfound optimism. "But for once, I feel like we're not just wandering in circles." Kelvin leaned back, the tension in his shoulders easing as a rare smile tugged at his lips. "Yeah, Ray," he said, his tone warm with quiet pride, "we're finally moving forward." As the sunset bathed the trees in a golden glow, they sat in companionable silence, acutely aware that the battle was far from won but equally certain that, together, they could chip away at the mountain ahead. The movement in Trenton didn't just grow, it roared to life. What had begun as a single spark in Grant Park fanned into a flame that spread through the town, igniting something raw and real in its people. This wasn't just about one incident anymore, it was a reckoning. The community stirred from a long slumber, shaking off the dust of resignation. Meetings sprang up everywhere, in the pews of old churches where hymns still lingered in the air, in living rooms cluttered with coffee cups and handwritten notes, in halls where the hum of voices drowned out the clatter of everyday life. Every soul had a stake in this, and the organizers fierce, tireless folks like Miss Clara, who'd lost a son to a system that never answered for it, made sure no one was left unheard. Raymond, to his own surprise, stood at the heart of it all. He'd never craved the spotlight, never wanted the weight of so many eyes on him. At 63, with knees that ached in the mornings and a heart that bore the scars of decades, he'd figured his time for standing up had passed. But the fire in him hadn't dimmed, it had only grown sharper, fueled by the bitter lessons of justice delayed and power unchecked. One morning, as he sat on his usual bench in Grant Park, a solitary figure against the backdrop of a waking world, a young woman approached. She moved with a quiet grace, her green hoodie faded at the edges, her jeans worn but clean. Her curly hair was pulled into a messy bun, strands escaping to frame her face, a face etched with both weariness and resolve. Her name was Anita, a newcomer to the rallies, always hovering at the edges, her presence steady but silent. "Mr. Brooks," she ventured, her voice trembling slightly, caught between reverence and uncertainty. Raymond glanced up from the newspaper spread across his lap, squinting against the soft glare of the rising sun. "That's me," he replied, his tone gentle but curious. She shifted her weight, hands fidgeting in her pockets, clearly wrestling with something inside. "I've been coming to the rallies," she began haltingly, "just listening, you know. I'm not one to speak up, never have been." She paused, her dark eyes flickering with doubt before she pressed on. "But I wanted to thank you for standing up, for giving people like me a voice. I didn't think anyone would ever hear us cheer me, but you and Mr. Kelvin, you've been at this so long, and now it feels like maybe, just maybe, things could be different." Raymond folded his paper with care, setting it beside him as he turned his full attention to her. The lines on his face softened, though his smile carried the exhaustion of a man who'd fought too many battles to count. "What you thanking me for?" he asked, his voice warm but firm. "It ain't just me out there, it's all of USI included. Every voice counts, even the ones that don't shout." Anita looked down, her sneakers scuffing the dirt, her shoulders hunching as if his words were too big to hold. "I didn't think anyone would care what I had to say," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "I mean, who am I? Just some girl juggling 2 jobs, barely keeping my head above water. I didn't think I could matter." Raymond shook his head, his gaze steady and unwavering. "That's where you're wrong, Anita. Every single person in this fight matters. You're not just anything. You're as much a part of this as I am, as Kelvin is. Don't you ever doubt that." The park buzzed softly round them, joggers pounding the paths, birds chirping in the branches above you as they sat in a quiet that felt almost sacred. Anita lingered beside him, her posture loosening as the weight of her own insignificance began to lift. She didn't need to have every answer, didn't need to be loud or bold to belong. "I want to help," she said after a long, thoughtful pause, her voice steadier now. I don't know how to start." Raymond chuckled, a low, rumbling sound that carried the comfort of experience. "Nobody knows where to start, girl. We all stumble into it, figure it out as we go. You'll find your way." She nodded, a faint spark igniting in her eyes, as if she'd just glimpsed her own strength for the first time. Across town, Kelvin was a force of nature, his days consumed with the gritty work of turning hope into action. He sat hunched over tables with community leaders, people like Marcus, a former mechanic with a voice that could command a room, and Lena, a school teacher whose quiet ferocity kept everyone on task. Together, they hammered out plans for their next big move, a public forum where the city's power broker Suffolk, eels, police, anyone with a badge or a title would face the people they'd sworn to serve. This wasn't about vague promises fading into the ether once the cameras turned off. They wanted transparency that couldn't be dodged, accountability that stuck. The forum was set for the high school auditorium, a cavernous space with scuffed floors and rows of seats that could hold hundreds. It was neutral ground, a place where the community's raw anger and fragile hope could meet the polished assurances of authority head-on. The night of the forum arrived, and the auditorium pulsed with life. People packed the space, some perched on seats, others sprawled cross-legged on the floor, a restless sea of faces spilling into the aisles and crowding the back walls. Raymond stood near the front, his cane planted firmly in the ground, his eyes scanning the throng with a mix of pride and trepidation. Beside him, Kelvin clutched a clipboard, his brow creased as he reviewed the night's agenda for the 10th time. "You ready for this, Ray?" he asked, glancing up with a half-smile. Raymond shrugged, the corner of his mouth twitching. "Ready or not, here we are." Kelvin's grin widened. "That's the spirit." The evening kicked off with the city council members, each stepping to the microphone with practiced poise. They spoke of unity, of progress, of ensuring Grant Park's shadow wouldn't fall again. But the crowd wasn't swayed by smooth words. They shifted in their seats, arms crossed, waiting for something real. When Captain Matthews took the stage, a ripple of tension coursed through the room. He was a known quantity, a man who'd stood at the rally and pledged change. But trust was a currency long spent. Matthews cleared his throat, his broad shoulders squared under the weight of every eye on him. "I know why you're here," he began, his voice steady but laced with a gravity that couldn't be faked. "You're here because the trust between this community and the police has been shattered. And that's on us. I'm not up here to make excuses, there aren't any. What happened to Mr. Brooks was wrong, plain and simple. It shouldn't have happened. And we're damn well committed to making sure it never does again." He paused, letting the words settle, gauging the room's pulse. A few heads nodded, cautious but listening. Others remained stony, arms still folded. "We've started new training for every officer," he pressed on. "Not just rules and regulations, but real training, how to de-escalate, how to connect with the people we serve, how to understand the history of this place and the folks who call it home. Knowing the law is not enough if you don't know the people you're protecting." The crowd softened slightly, a murmur of interest threading through the tension. But it wasn't enough. A hand shot up from the back, a young man, weary and sharp-eyed, his voice cutting through the hush. "Training's all well and good, but how do we know this ain't just more talk? What's gonna happen when an officer crosses the line again? Who's holding them accountable?" The room stilled, every breath held as Matthews met the question head-on. He nodded, slow and deliberate, acknowledging the weight of it. "That's a fair challenge," he said, his tone unflinching. "It's not just about training. We're putting together a civilian oversight board, people from right here in Trenton. You'll have access to reports, body cam footage, the works. You'll have the power to call out what's wrong and demand answers. We can't police ourselves if you don't trust us. And this board's gonna make damn sure there's light on every corner of what we do." The murmur swelled, louder now, tinged with cautious approval. It wasn't blind faith. Skepticism still lingered like smoke, but the idea of real power, of a system where the community could wield the scales of justice, struck a chord they hadn't expected. Raymond caught Kelvin's eye, a flicker of something unspoken passing between them, hope, maybe, or the faint outline of progress. The lesson was clear. Power, when abused, left scars that didn't fade, but when challenged, it could bend. And in that crowded auditorium, under the harsh glare of fluorescent lights, they were bending it, inch by painful inch, toward something better. The room buzzed with restless energy as the offer was laid out before them. A sum that struck him like a quiet thunderclap. "That's more than I ever imagined they'd put on the table," he murmured under his breath, his voice trembling with a mix of disbelief and cautious hope. Kelvin, standing beside him, gave a slow, deliberate nod, his eyes fixed on the crowd. "It's something," he replied, his tone measured but firm. "A stepping stone, maybe. But don't fool yourself, night's far from over." The air was thick with anticipation. And as more hands shot up into the dimly lit auditorium, the questions came fast and unrelenting. Voices rose, some steady, others cracking with emotion, as people peeled back the layers of their lives to share stories that had long been buried. There were tales of trembling encounters with police officers, moments when fear had coiled tight in their chests, and others when humiliation had burned so deep it left scars no one could see. Captain Matthews stood rooted to the stage, a solitary figure under the harsh glow of the spotlight. He didn't flinch or turn away, didn't try to dodge the weight of what was being said. His broad shoulders sagged slightly, not from defeat, but from the sheer exhaustion of listening, truly listening, to a room full of raw, unfiltered truth. He absorbed every word, every tear-streaked face, every shaky breath, letting it settle into him like stones in a riverbed. By the time the clock ticked toward midnight, it was painfully clear that this forum had barely cracked open the door to something much bigger, something sprawling and messy that would demand far more than a single night to unravel. Justice, they were learning, was not a quick fix, it was a slow, grinding wheel, and its turning would test them all. As the crowd began to thin, drifting out into the cool night, Rond and Kelvin lingered near the stage, their voices low as they exchanged words with a handful of city officials. Their conversation was punctuated by nods and furrowed brows, a quiet negotiation of trust and expectation. Then came Captain Matthews, his heavy boots thudding softly against the wooden floor as he approached. His face was etched with fatigue, lines deepening around his eyes, but there was a flicker of resolve in his gaze that refused to dim. "Raymond, Kelvin," he greeted them, his voice rough with weariness yet carrying a note of respect that hadn't been there before. "I know this doesn't fix everything. Hell, I know it's not even close to enough. But I'm telling you now, we're in this for the long haul. We've got work to do, and we're not backing down." Kelvin reached out, his handshake firm and unyielding as he locked eyes with Matthews. "We'll hold you to that, Captain," he said, his words a promise and a warning rolled into one. "And if you need USR voices, our Hansai know damn well where to find us." Matthews managed a faint smile, the kind that barely lifted the corners of his mouth but softened the hardness in his face. "I'll take you up on that," he replied. "We need people like you people who won't let us off the hook if this is going to mean anything." Raymond stood a step back, watching the exchange unfold like a scene from a play he'd seen too many times before. Promises of change, of progress, they were old lines, worn thin by years of disappointment. But tonight, something stirred in him, a shift he couldn't quite name. Maybe it was the way Matthews's eyes betrayed a man wrestling with the flaws of a system he'd spent his life upholding, a man finally tired of pretending it was perfect. Or maybe it was the crowd itself, the way they'd come together not just to shout into the void, but to roll up their sleeves and search for answers. As the last echoes of the night faded, Raymond and Kelvin stepped out into the brisk air, the chill wrapping around them like a shroud. They walked in silence for a stretch, the crunch of gravel under their shoes the only sound between them. Each was lost in a tangle of thought-choke warring with doubt, exhaustion battling resolve. Finally, Raymond broke the quiet, his voice cutting through the stillness. "You really think this'll change anything, Kel?" Kelvin turned to him, his expression grave, but lit with a spark of something stubborn, something alive. "I think it's a start, Ray," he said, his words deliberate. "A real one. I have to believe that." Raymond nodded, slow and thoughtful, his mind still churning through the night's revelations. He'd spent decades fighting for this marching, speaking, bleeding for a world that too often refused to budge. There were nights when the weight of it all threatened to crush him, when he wondered if the struggle was just a fool's errand. But then he saw them again in his mind's eye, the young faces in the crowd, the voices rising like a tide, demanding to be heard, and deep in his bones, he knew it mattered. It had to. In the weeks that followed, the ripples of that night began to spread. The Civilian Oversight Board took shape, a fragile but determined thing, and the community didn't hesitate to claim it as their own. People from every corner of the city stepped forward, teachers with tired eyes, mechanics with grease-stained hands, mothers with fire in their voices signing up to watch over the changes. Promised to the police department, Raymond found himself pulled deeper into the fray than he'd planned. He'd thought the forum would be his last stand, a chance to pass the torch to the younger ones and fade into the background. But his phone wouldn't stop ringing. Kelvin's voice crackled through the line again and again, insistent, pulling him back in. "You've still got work to do, Ray," Kelvin told him one afternoon as they sat on a weathered bench in Grant Park, the sun slanting through the trees. "You're the heartbeat of this thing, whether you like it or not." Raymond chuckled, waving off the praise with a shake of his head. But the words sank into him all the same. He knew Kelvin was right. This wasn't the role he'd pictured for himself at the stage of life, gray hair creeping in, joints creaking a little louder each morning, but it was his. And if he could help steer the next generation through this storm, he'd be damned if he'd walk away now. One day, as he sat alone on that same bench, watching the park come alive with laughter and footsteps, his mind drifted back to where it had all started. That run-in with Officer Clark years ago, it had been just one thread in a tapestry of indignities, woven across his life. But this time, the fabric had shifted. The community had risen, their voices a chorus that refused to be ignored, and for once, it felt like someone was listening. Then came Anita, her green hoodie a familiar splash of color against the park's muted tones as she approached. She sat beside him, her shy smile breaking through the quiet like sunlight through clouds. "You're becoming a regular," Raymond teased, his eyes crinkling with warmth. She laughed, a soft sound that carried a new steadiness. "Yeah, I guess I am," she said, settling into the silence that followed. They watched the world move around them, kids chasing each other across the grass, the old men playing chess under the oaks, and for a moment, there was peace. Not just the absence of noise, but something deeper, something earned. It was the peace of knowing they were finally on a path that might lead somewhere better. "I think I'm ready," Anita said suddenly, her voice small but sure. Raymond turned to her, curiosity flickering in his gaze. "Ready for what?" he asked. She took a breath, her hands twisting in her lap. "To speak up," she said. "To really be part of this. I've been hanging back, watching, for too long. It's time." Raymond's smile widened, pride swelling in his chest like a tide. "You'll do just fine," he told her, his voice steady with certainty. "I know you will." As the sun dipped low over Grant Park, painting the trees and paths in hues of gold, Raymond felt a quiet shift inside him, a sense of fullness, of completion. The road ahead stretched long and uncertain, littered with obstacles he couldn't yet see. Justice, he knew, was a fragile thing, easily broken by those who wielded power without care. But the lesson of that night, of Matthews's weary resolve and the crowd's unyielding spirit, lingered with him. When power was abused, consequences followed, not always swift, not always clean, but inevitable. And for the first time in years, he didn't feel like he was walking that road alone. That, for now, was enough.